So first of all, a ginormous welcome to you all this morning. I'm going to just run through a bit about how the day is going to function and a bit about just sort of some scene setting about why we're doing this. So to start with, you're going to hear some brilliant speakers. We've just got such a great mix, and they're going to share all sorts of insights. So we're going to hear a real mix of some theoretical academic stuff, some really strong experiences of which there's so much to learn, often the most to learn from what actually happens in real life, and then some foresight, futures thinking as well. So it's just a really good mix. There's also going to be some interactive sessions, so you're going to be able to be in groups and do some thinking together, because of course that's what we're all about at Dialogue Matters, is, you know, bringing brains together that can share all sorts of knowledges and insights. So I am certain you're going to take away some insights and ideas and solutions. I am just going to acknowledge the numbers attending. So when we do conferences, we normally get over 100, 150. We've had enormous, more than any other conference, interest in this one, but we've also had more than ever people saying that they're under embargoes to spend from public bodies. So a lot of public bodies, a lot of interest in public bodies, but they are an embargo to go on any events like this. So that has hit our event a bit. However, of those of you who are here and have made it, I think that we're just going to have a really interesting morning. So just a little bit about who on earth are we to be putting on events like this. So we're really tiny. There's only 6 of us. We've been going since 2000, so this is our 25th birthday. And we help people meet across their differences of values and beliefs and understandings and knowledges and interests to agree and plan and get on with some action. So we do all of this stuff. We design, process, facilitate, train. I've already said there's a core team of 6 plus a whole bunch of associates, and welcome to you, the associates you're on today. That's brilliant to see you again. We've worked all over the place, and we've worked across all sorts of different cultures and sectors and education, and with a whole variety of different people. We've worked with Indigenous people and their knowledges. We've worked with global climate experts and their knowledges, and we champion great practice. So that's a little bit about who we are, and that doesn't explain to you why we're doing this. So we do occasional conferences. I haven't actually counted, but I'm imagining this is about our 9th or 10th that we've done over the 25 years that we've existed. And what we have found in some research I'm going to tell you a bit more about in a moment is that projects are working with the very best of intent. There is no question about that. But what they're not knowing or drawing on is evidence about what actually works. And we seem to be a sector who's enormously good. I'm saying as a sector, environmental sector, whether you're land, sea, rivers, or topic-based, or doing wilding or species, whatever it brings you here. But we seem to be enormously good at talking about evidence-based decision-making, and by that we kind of mean ecology and hydrology and all sorts of other ologies and economics and all of those kind of subjects. And what we're not at all good at, I think, as a sector, is finding out and drawing on the evidence about decision-making itself, or about participation. I'll be introducing some of that in a moment, and also in my bit later. So today is part of our effort to address that and that gap and get some knowledges out there. So the evidence base for the reasons for saying this is partly we don't do a lot of research. Maybe about, I don't know, 20% of our work is actually research based. But we've done work for English Nature years ago, Scottish Government on engagement, empowerment and land use and land management, Natural England on landscape governance and justice, and currently just completing some work for the EU around marine spatial planning and the participation, the quality of what was done around participation in marine spatial planning across Europe. And in total, we've looked in detail at about 80 case examples, but I'm also part of some international research teams. So one of them is specifically looking at the effect of sharing power on the outcomes, socially just and biodiversity outcomes. What effect does that have? And I think we're going to be hearing from a speaker who's only able to join us, Lou. So she's only able to join us for her presentation because she's got other commitments today. But we've also got between us and with associates many more years than 27 years of pioneering, learning and doing in this space. But as Dialogue Matters, about 150 projects. We sometimes are working very complex, very conflicted, and sometimes both. That encompasses all different types of habitat and space, and subjects like fisheries or farming or species work or climate change. We've worked in a whole array of different countries. And as I already said, we've worked across different cultures and sectors and levels of education, different ages. So we've got some people on today who we did some work with where we involve young people to set the vision, and through to seniors with all sorts of their wisdoms and knowledges. So we've worked right across all of that. So when we know that there's a gap in understanding, some of that's from the research we've done, but it's also from the practice we have and the amount that we explain and work with when we're commissioned to do some work, the amount of explaining and work we need to do about how some of this all works. So in 2024, last year, we were asked by Natural England to do some research, and the focus was landscape governance and justice. It included all types of landscapes, so whether that's urban or rural, wild, intensely managed. But what I'm going to share with you applies to all environmental projects working on change. And that little picture on the left is actually a picture up to my village where I live. The fields are not normally ploughed by horses around that. We're not quite there. That's a farm that does special events, but that is looking up to the village. Anybody knows it, you can just about make out the crown in the chalk hill above the village. But key findings from the research we did last year was we put out a survey for case examples, success stories, working in participation and partnerships for change. A lot of them were landscape scale because that's the sort of target that we were going for, but there were others as well. There was, I think, a couple of marine and so on. And of the 33, we found that 21, while saying they were doing things in a very participatory and inclusive way, actually was sectoral. And by sectoral, I mean their approach and their governance was all that the environmentalists made and held all the power to make decisions. And they might be doing all this great wider engagement to gather views and to disseminate their decisions, but fundamentally, it was a narrow part of the views that would be relevant to landscape, making the decisions about what the priorities for landscape were. 4 were full co-creation, co-delivery, and we'll explain that language a bit later, or it'll merge as different speakers talk about it, with professional facilitation. 8 were either mixed or we couldn't quite tell what was going on from the way they responded to the survey, so we were a bit unsure. There were quite a lot of claims of co-design with no evidence that that is what was happening. So we've got a problem with what's referred to as linguistic drift, where the language shifts from what it's originally conceived to mean and is adopted by a sector, but it's adopted in a way that has lost its original intent. And to our surprise, some were multi-benefit. So they were looking at a landscape from the perspective, what could it do around flooding, around carbon sequestration, around biodiversity gain, around recreation benefit, around economic benefit. So some were like that, but the majority were not. And that's a huge missed opportunity to achieve much more bang for your buck, if you like, and for your effort. And so that's what made us think we need to try and bring understanding to some of what we researched and learned, and that's what led to today. Another thing we did during the event is that we had, I'm really sorry, somebody's coming to the door of the office. I'm sorry, could you just go and see what that's about? Oh, apparently a parcel delivery. Right, so we also invited leading, just would happen, wouldn't it? No. Some leading landscape experts, so some from academia, some from organisations that oversee multiple, like national parks or protected landscapes, some who are very concerned about inclusivity. So it's a real eclectic mix, but we went through a little workshop with them and we did this 3 horizons method. So just in case you're unfamiliar with it, horizon 1 is what's business as usual, what's going on now that's gradually losing its fitness for purpose, but some of that is a legacy that needs to go forward and is worth conserving. Horizon 3, I'm going to leap to horizon 3, which is the green line, and that's about what's emerging already that's taking us to a viable future. And then horizon 2 is the middle bit, which is like what connects and links, what gets us from what's waning in relevance to what will be a viable future. So we asked them that, and I'm going to start with their future vision. So their future vision was of outcomes that were regenerative and thriving and adaptive, and that's thriving for more than humans, which is a language more than humans, beyond humans, is language coming in to honour and respect the other species we share the planet with, and that it enabled a diversity of belonging, by which they meant that you didn't just have a sense of belonging to a landscape because of the way it was interpreted to you, or because you live there, or because you walk there, but you could go there and you can experience it spiritually, or through the arts, or through a very different ethnic lens, or a different or neurodiversity lens, so that there were very different senses and ways of belonging to landscapes and feeling like you're welcome there. And the decision making that would get us there would embrace those very different cultural visions and ways of knowing, including feelings and art and story. And that is not prevalent really in the sector for the way we go about making decisions about projects. That it would recognise the intrinsic value of landscapes, not just for its own, not for its own sake, and not because it's in service to us. So moving away from ecosystem services and service-based thinking. Power sharing with many different kinds of people. Systems thinking, we've got a speaker talking on that later this morning, so I won't explain that in much more detail. Youth voices at the table. So actually in the dialogue, helping to shape the future that they will live with most. And this beyond human voices and perspectives are heard. And then what do they think is waning or needs to be waning? And that's governance, which is top down and sectoral, which is experienced by others as undemocratic, unjust, risk averse, narrow, reductive, siloed and excluding, which is a bit upsetting to think that's how other people experience the environment sector, but sadly they often do. Out-of-date concepts for wilderness and countryside, thinking science and ecosystem services are the only ways to understand, and link with that the commodification and monetization of nature and natural processes, and that attempts to embed capitalism and capitalistic worldviews in our understanding of nature and the natural. And what do they think is emerging that's going to take us from one thing to another? Well, they've got collaborative and integrated working at scale, shifting language from conservation to restoration, recovery and rewilding, use of the arts, which I've mentioned several times, green financing, though huge caution that green financing doesn't invest in projects and then determine everything, which then undermines any attempts to draw in other voices. Again, hearing beyond human voices, regenerative governance, procedural justice and systems thinking, all of which terms will be explained later today, and genuine real co-design and co-delivery to get us there. And then we also had a literature review, and we may be hearing more about that later because the person who did it, Chris, is on the call now and will be giving a presentation later. But this is a sort of slides worth of summary, so there was obviously far more to it than this. And you'll see an echo to what was said in the workshop. So solutions need to be built on trust collaboratively. The complexity requires these multifunctional holistic perspectives, which, as you've heard me say, many of the projects did not have. That's going to require an institutional change in the way that we go about things, and whether the institution is the project or an NGO that funds it or a public body, whatever it is, that we're going to need to start thinking differently about the way we organise ourselves. Multiple and diverse stakeholders involved actually in the decision making, prioritising inclusive governance models and deliberative decision making, and those will be unpacked a bit during the morning. Adaptive co-management, we've obviously got to be really, really adaptive because of everything that is changing so rapidly around, particularly with climate change, very different funding, very different policy going on. That's going to accelerate even more in the light of what's going on, the geopolitics going on at the moment. And the scale and connectivity in decision making. So to move away from piecemeal and small and also short term, to transcend those political cycles and short term interests. So it's because all of this is where we got to in our research, or some of where we got to in our research, but there's a big gap between this and what is going on in practice, which we also found that we're putting on this event. So guidance on how things are going to work today, just to give you a feel. So we've got in a couple of breaks, and so you've got a bit of time to, comfort and stretch and try and restore yourself. Working online, as we all know, is very demanding. If you could mute for presentations, there will be facilitated questions and answers, but if you could put your questions in chat, which is more equitable and gives us more of a chance to get through as many as possible. When we place you in breakout groups, and everybody knows this now, but there'll be a slight lag. When you're in your breakout group, unmute so that when you're in a great group, there will be a facilitator in each group. Don't use your hands up, the icon in the system to do a hands up to make your point, because we want to encourage a natural flow. So somebody says something, somebody else responds, rather than the hands up and then you end up with a long chain of people all speaking out of order to something that was said 10 minutes earlier. And we will be recording this event so that we can share some of these presentations maybe in a year or so, or I don't know, we work that out so that we can get this information out to many more people. And when you're in your breakout groups, these are guidelines we use as standard when we're facilitating as dialogue matters. So just whisk through them quickly. So everybody's got a right to be heard to express their view. One person speak at a time, please. Of course, when you're on Zoom, it automatically fixes on where some noise is coming from. So it sort of does that anyway. If you could aim to be concise so others have a chance, just give their and share their thoughts, and aim to keep on the task, which will be the question that you're being invited to consider at that point. And aim to use language that all can understand. There is a shed load of acronyms and terms, and we speak our language without realizing just how impenetrable it is to everybody else. But even within the sector, people use different languages, like marine uses very different acronyms to land and language differently. So just let's be sensitive to that and try and use everyday language as much as possible. We will be typing up what you say, and that's how we're going to record it when you're in breakout groups. So that won't be attributed, and we won't be recording breakout groups. But what is typed, our facilitators will type up what you're saying, and then we'll share that record with everybody who's here afterwards. Breaks tight. And I don't know how much this needs saying, but we always have this one. Feel free to disagree, but don't be disagreeable. I know there's some very different views and opinions in this space, but I don't think we risk of any of that. But it's just one of our standard things. So there we go. In terms of the structure of the day, this briefing about why we're all here. Then we're going to have a session on futures thinking and a panel, questions and answers for them. Then a short break, but then some stories to inspire and work in the real world. Then some breakout groups to explore some of what's landing or striking you as relevant. Then another short break. Then we're going to look at some fresh ideas and insights that are emerging. Some of them I've already alluded to in that briefing. And then some more breakout groups and then wrap up. So that's the rough structure of the day. And that's me done. So Ross,
thanks,
over to
Diana.
you.
Thank you, Diana. So in this first session, welcome to you, I should say, first of all. Welcome to those who joined us during Diana's introduction there. So the first session we've got this morning is Futures Thinking, and we are going to be hearing from 3 speakers who've been looking at future trends and changes relevant to partnerships and participation in different environments. And first up, we have Chris Short. If you want to start sharing your presentation. Chris is an associate professor in environmental governance at University of Gloucestershire. He's been focusing on understanding land and water management at different scales, especially in response to the challenges of climate change and environmental decline. So I'm going to hand over to you, Chris. I'll give you a 1 minute. So I will say out loud, Chris, you've got 1 minute to go, or something along those lines to give you a prompt.
Okay, hang on a minute. I've just messed up my screen sharing.
That's all right. You get the hot seat because you're the first one up. So
Do this all the time, and then the one time you want to do it correctly.
That's all right. And just a reminder for everyone else, if you can just remain on mute whilst speakers are presenting, but do feel free to drop any thought questions into the chat box, and after the 3 speakers have given their presentations, there will be around about 10 minutes for a panel question and answer session. I think at the moment you're sharing your Zoom screen, and now we've got your presentation, Chris. All good to go.
Perfect.
Maybe it's slightly the wrong view. If you want to swap it,
presentation screen.
we can see your we can see your screen.
Sorry, we can Chris, we can see your notes and your presenter view. There we go. Yay, go.
Perfect. Excellent. Okay. So thank you very much. Lovely to see everybody. Thanks for the introduction, Diana and Ross. And yeah, great to work with you on that Natural England project. It strikes me that this is a bit of a pivotal time for both nature, climate and people. My starting point is that people are part of nature and climate. If you take us away from nature, it's bad for our health and well-being. So this session, I'm going to share some of that research that we looked at in the Natural England project, as well as some initiatives we're involved in about reconnecting people with nature and climate, because that, in a sense, I feel is our starting point. So the key messages I'm going to talk about was about why does it matter Why does it matter that people and nature and climate are all interlinked? What are these increasing opportunities for reconnecting? And that within that, it's really important that we avoid this sort of binary thinking about rural or urban or green and grey. And the opportunity is to engage in some innovation and collective thinking. So the landscapes we're thinking about need to be more diverse in order to reverse decline in biodiversity. So we need to rethink our relationship with landscapes. There's some opportunities. We've got growth in landscape scale projects, helping with climate and nature, and these give us new opportunities for reconnecting community participation, citizen science, and these are really important for our relationship. But these are interesting times. There's a consistent focus around growth, and that's humans' growth of benefit. There's a nexus around nature versus food versus energy versus climate, carbon, etc. And these debates seem to be really polarized, particularly on coverage of landscape issues. And these aren't straightforward things. So complicated issues struggle in gaining traction in terms of attention. That's effectively what we want. Or, seemingly if you want things to move, then you need to grab people's attention. So we need to find an alternative for that. And just an example I read yesterday, the paper in Conservation Letters was 17% of the world's peatlands are protected, even though we know that they're immensely important for carbon storage, they're vulnerable for degrading, they're fantastic biodiversity sites, etc. So all of that talk around nature and their importance for climate, and yet worldwide 17% are protected. So we think we need to flip that. So it's not that globally we're going to sort that out. Actually, locally, maybe we're going to sort that out. We need to have a greater role for Indigenous and people, local communities, in managing these spaces, understanding why they're important. But there's opportunities, as I say in there, we've been invited to have a conversation within England around a land use framework. We should take up that opportunity. Nature-based solutions appear to be on the agenda now and commonly talked about. Putting into, we'll probably hear more about that later. There's funding for collaborative schemes, etc. So there are positive signs. But let's have a look at some of the evidence here. So why does it matter? Why does it matter to us as humans to be in nature and experiencing climate? Well, there is significant evidence that connecting positive benefits of green environments is fantastic for our human happiness and well-being. And it also matters, it's that boost to our health and well-being, but it matters more the better the biodiversity. I think that's important. So the fine-tuning of this evidence is around the levels of biodiversity within that relationship show a causality with the degree of species richness or abundance sense of being established. So better nature is a bigger boost. And that forms what we increasingly call the natural health service. And this is being offered by health professionals and social prescribing. And we're beginning to see that benefit, which is excellent. The other flip side of this is that we're also aware, or the evidence shows that you also have these emotive, inspiring experiences. And maybe you can remember the first time you saw a red squirrel, or you saw a dragonfly emerging from a larvae emerging from a pond and transforming into an adult. Those are memorable occasions, and that deepens our depth of immersion and involvement within nature and our connection to it. And linked to this, we know that childhood impacts also inform future actions about your levels of awareness, your behaviour towards the environment, etc. And there's a concern that there's this loss of equity, the equity of opportunity, in the sense as children grow up away from nature or disconnected from nature, not having these emotive, immersive experiences, that it will can impact future behavior in the long term. So that's why it matters to us. It's fundamental to our existence. So looking at landscapes as we did in this literature review, there's a purposive landscape change and futures we have. We understand now that landscapes are far more than just a physical entity. They've got dynamic histories, they carry cultural, social, political, economic, ecological significance of great layers and varies. You only need to move a few miles to understand how landscapes can change quite dramatically. And these are things that we don't necessarily take into account. Reference back to Diana's point about those projects, which being singular objective. If they're a singular objective, then they're missing large chunks of what would be potentially interesting and informative. So in that sense, we need to understand how decisions are made at scale. A mix of informal and informal actions by a range of stakeholders, often not connected or in some way. So starting up those sorts of projects, large-scale projects, is understanding what happens there. Participation in deliberative decision-making, that's an opportunity, it's sensible, that's a good way of pulling those different decisions and strengthening that landscape governance. Looking at the importance of local context, purpose, rationale, effectively balancing different initiatives. And we'll so one of the approaches looking at adaptive co-management, just unpack that a little bit. Co-management means that you're working together with different stakeholders. You're bringing different interests and groups together around a table to consider those approaches. We might talk about it later, but we're talking about when we talk about water, because one of the most developed ones is this catchment-based approach, where you bring all those different fishing communities, farmers, etc., around the room talking about effective management, agreeing a way forward. Adaptive means that you have regular review points. So often you'll see these approaches as a spiral, a circle. You consider, you decide, you implement, you review, etc. Go round in a circle. The adaptive means it's a corkscrew, so you don't come back to the same place as you're sort of moving and adapting and changing what you do. And we do this at multiple scales, essentially. So projects can take on many different sizes, etc. So the way in which you do that, and then the idea is you promote connectivity between. That's clear sense what the literature says. So I just wanted to touch on some example sense where we looked at this, and related to the work we did with Diana. We worked with a company with looking at a nature recovery project around their issues. They came to us interested in local engagement. So how do we do it? Essentially was their question. Well, you just embed it at the start. So as much as you're going to start a project and you're looking about what biodiversity is there, you also look around saying what stakeholders, what interest groups, what's the local community at that point. So you do a baseline, etc. If you want that in that language, you do a baseline survey of your people as much as you do about your biodiversity, with the intention that you're going to integrate that local knowledge alongside your science. So they know, almost certainly many people around that will know that land as well as anybody. And so you'll be bringing your external science in to sit alongside that internal existing local knowledge. Really important to understand that no one size fits all. You need to tweak, adapt, and understand particularly how things like power dynamic works. who who's engaging, how are they engaging, how are you going to build that crucial word called trust within that process, how are you going to be seen to be transparent and accountable. Really important that you can think big, but you do that by acting locally. Not there are plenty of projects we've looked at which have got those sort of wonderful landscapes, galloping horses, eagles flying around, and basically it's just a former arable field. So in other words, there might be a precision of what they want, but it isn't realistic of what's happening. So be local, rooted in communities, and then 3 watchwords around that process: equity, accountability, transparency. And that's a link to just that bit of work. The next one we've talked about long-term agreements, etc. So how are you going to manage that amongst stakeholders? This is a new game. How are you going to manage for 30 years within that space? First option, this is work we did for a DEFRA test and trial. You look at how receptive, we explored how receptive buyers, in other words, non-out farming in this sense, people who wanted to get involved and fund long-term projects were, and the sellers, in other words, land managers. We built and looked at particularly agro-environment schemes for land managers. They all knew and understood those schemes. They're 5 to 10 years. So how different is a 30-year scheme? Quite different. Essentially, you're planning ahead for a generation. And the key thing they wanted were regular evaluations, so they knew and understood sense where they could going. You had to link adjustments into management alongside that, but each one of those projects essentially bespoke. And we did an infographic, which you can see here.
1 minute to go, Chris.
Read in detail. Sorry, Ross.
1 minute to go.
Oh my goodness. Need for more guidance, etc., and better time management. So, right. Well, the last one I really wanted to talk about was climathons. You've probably all heard of a hackathon, which is where you spend detailed amount of time of this. These are really interesting opportunities for local partners. It's co-designed because we work with local groups to establish them. It could be on transport, could be on energy, could be on land management. And the key value of these events is they make national issues tangible at the local level. So it's about embedding net zero and creating a clear pathway. So you have a warm-up session online, then you spend a day looking at a local project and thinking about what possible initiatives could be taken forward. Again, a range of stakeholders. And here's a map. This is one we did in Bude on land management. And you have a beautiful an artist who can come along and create a poster, which is then lives long. And what we want to do with these projects is go back to them. So back to my key messages, it really matters that people, nature and climate, we need to be imaginative about how we can, those reconnections between people and nature and climate, avoid this binary thinking and really focus about this innovation and collective thinking. And that's academics working with all sorts of people. And that's just what we like doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. So next up, I'm going to invite Emma McKinley. She's a senior research fellow at Cardiff University, specialising in understanding the complex relationships between society and the sea. She founded the Marine Social Science Network and serves on several prestigious committees, including the UK's National Decade Committee for the UN Ocean Decade and the IOC UNESCO's Global Group of Experts on Ocean Literacy. Welcome.
Thanks, Ross. I hate intros. Oh my goodness, they make me feel so uncomfortable. Thank you very much for that. Thank you for inviting me. I hope you can all see my slides. I'm assuming you can, if nobody's telling me you can't, and that they're in full screen. Thanks so much to Diana and Chris for the scene setting you've done so far. I think some of what I'll say will probably echo what you've said, which is a good thing. And some of what Chris has said are things I didn't think I had time to squeeze in. So that's great. We're covering it together. As I said, I'm a marine social scientist, so my take on this is very much thinking about where we're going in terms of marine, coastal, and ocean research. And really, in this short talk, I'm not really presenting results from my work. There's a little bit of that, but really, I'm drawing on a lot of work that others in the field of marine and coastal and ocean research have been working on to try and identify some, I guess, key points and areas that I'm seeing emerge time and time again as where we might be going, where we should be going, where we should be focusing on, or what key topics we're thinking about, and where I think partnership will really be central to delivering those successfully. So when we think about the marine and coastal landscape in terms of governance and what's driving forward research and practice, it is an absolute mix of so many different international and national obligations. This very colourful slide that you can see right now is just a tiny selection of some of the different guidelines and commitments that we have agreed to support sustainable ocean futures, or to try to realise and work towards sustainable ocean futures, whatever that might look like or whatever that might mean. See things like the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, regardless of whether the sector that you work in. We're currently sitting halfway through the UN Ocean Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in detail, because that's really driving forward a lot of work that's happening in ocean research. At a European scale, we have Mission Starfish, which is talking about the need to restore our ocean and coastal waters, including our inland waters. So trying to take that whole systems thinking, which again, I highlight later on, but recognizing that we need to challenge and revamp governance. So moving away from that status quo and that business as usual approach, and also perhaps filling, I'm not sure I like the wording around filling the knowledge and emotional gap, recognizing that there are different knowledges and emotional connections, that we need to understand those and look at how we can bring people into the conversation by having that understanding, is my preference. And then, of course, here in the UK, we have things like the 25-year environment plan, the Environmental Improvement Plan. In Wales, where I'm based, we have the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which really centres various components of well-being, including social, cultural, economic, and environmental. So really bringing that whole system, that whole society approach, I guess, sort of trying to bring some of the points that Chris was making around bringing together people and nature rather than being seen as separate. And I think that dichotomy is something that's got us into quite a lot of trouble over recent years. So really bringing us together as a whole system and recognizing we are all part of that system. Now, when I was preparing for this talk, I was thinking about all of the different horizon scanning type of work that happens within the research field. So many of us, myself included, have been part of work to try to identify what our key research priorities are, right down from understanding the research questions around invasive alien species, to microbiome research, to salt marsh research, to marine social sciences, to the priority questions for marine and coastal policy. And what I really came to think about when I was kind of finding all of these different horizon scans that I knew were part of the research landscape was that, again, all of this comes down to working together, working in collaboration, in partnership for us to be able to address these research questions, for us to be able to deliver the research needed to co-identify solutions, to implement management in a way that is equitable, accessible, supportive of coastal communities and all communities. And so I think that's really, it's a really fundamental part of today's session, is centering those ideas around partnership and ensuring they are done effectively and collaboratively in a way that is equitable for all. I also wanted to kind of go back to the Ocean Decade in terms of the framing of a lot of the ocean research that's happening right now, because I think some of the wording of the mission statement is important for us to think about when we talk about partnership. And that includes words like the science we need for the ocean we want. So what is science, what science gets to be included, whose research, whose knowledge gets to be included in that discussion, and who is the we in that statement, whose voices, whose values have been included as we develop that framework and that roadmap to the future for our ocean. So I think it's important for us to think about that as we think about partnership working for marine and coastal research and for broader environmental research. For someone who has moved across natural and social sciences, so I now sit very, very firmly within marine social sciences, but I started as a marine biologist. And for me, one of the really positive things that's come from the Ocean Decade has been this quote from the original implementation plan that was released in probably 2019, which defines ocean science as broad and recognises the need to encompass natural and social sciences, including local and indigenous knowledges. I would also argue it needs to include arts and humanities research in there as well, and that we need to ensure that we're integrating that across science and policy, science innovation, and science and practice as well. So all of those components are really important, and recognising ocean science or ocean research as being broad and deep and embracing a range of disciplines and expertise is really crucially important. And that's really necessary for us to kind of embrace going forward if we're going to try to address the 10 challenges set out by the Ocean Decade. So the Ocean Decade, as I said, is halfway through, and we have 5 more years to deliver against these 10 really big challenges. And I don't think anybody would argue with these being part of the future trajectory of what we need to do to support sustainable oceans. Like we need to understand how we can better protect and restore our marine ecosystems and our marine biodiversity. We need to ensure we have food security for our global population. We have to ensure we have resilient and sustainable and equitable ocean economies and coastal communities. And of course, we need to think about the link between ocean and climate. My favorite challenge, if that's something that you can have, is very much around that challenge 10, which has been reframed from changing societies, changing humanity's relationship with the ocean through the Vision 2030 process to being restore society's relationship with the ocean, really recognizing that there are communities, there are societies who have incredibly positive, sustainable, inclusive relationships with the ocean, where the ocean is part of their community and part of their society. And we have an opportunity to learn from them, to work in partnership with those communities, to learn and support where perhaps those relationships have been lost and where we do need to have that restoration effort. And for those of us who are working in social sciences and work in ocean literacy and public perceptions work, I think we really feel that Challenge 10 underpins the successful delivery of each of the other 9 challenges. If we don't bring people along with us on that kind of journey, on that discussion, then we won't successfully deliver solutions to address each of the other 9 challenges. I'm super conscious of time. 15 minutes goes very, very quickly. So some of the things I wanted to really quickly kind of talk through, and this is very much a whistle-stop tour of some of the key kind of things that I've seen come out increasingly through the kind of work I do, is the need to recognise diverse values and ocean connections. And these frameworks, so the IPBES values framework, the Intergovernmental Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, has done a lot of work in recent years, recognising the need to consider, understand, integrate different ways of valuing our natural environment, including those intrinsic values that Diana mentioned, valuing nature for nature's sake, not because it gives us something, and recognising that is just as important. And also the framework of ocean literacy, so recognising ocean-human relationships and the interconnectedness between that have been 2 of the key underpinning frameworks that I've been working with through the Diverse Marine Values Project. And that's been really grounded in the next topic, which has been transdisciplinarity. So really thinking how we can work more effectively in not just a multidisciplinary way or a multi-sector way, but a way that is truly transdisciplinary, where we're bringing in and appreciating and valuing insights and knowledges from across not only different academic disciplines, but different sectors, community groups, recognizing that there are those different elements of expertise and knowledge that should be valued and included within decision-making and within partnership working. This paper kind of explores the different conditions that are needed to support inter and transdisciplinarity. So the need to dedicate time and resource to supporting that relationship building, being open to new points of view and embracing them, and kind of recognizing that everybody can have different perspectives and that's okay. We can still work together. being humble enough to learn from each other, and to ensure that we're leaving nobody behind. So we're thinking about accessibility as we talk about partnership working in a transdisciplinary way. Diana's already mentioned championing arts-based research, and through the Diverse Marine Values Project, we've been really trying to think about how we diversify our ocean research toolkit. So alongside social science research methods like interviews and questionnaires and focus groups that lots of us will be very familiar with, we've been using a lot of arts-based research, including theatre and community voice methods, so filmed interview processes, digital stories, photo essays, and a range of different methods to explore different types of relationships and ensure we're reaching different types of people through those methods as well. So again, talking, kind of reflecting on a comment that Chris made about needing to understand that one size won't fit everybody. We need to think about how we can work in partnership with others, using different methods to ensure we're engaging as many people as possible. Catchment to coast and whole system thinking is really becoming more and more dominant kind of work I do. So although I'm very much a salty person, even though I've moved from biology to social sciences, I've very much stayed with my feet in salty water. But increasingly, I think we're recognizing that we can't work in that siloed way. We have to take that whole landscape, whole system approach, because what happens upstream affects our coasts, affects our seas, our ocean. And so we need to bring in that whole system thinking, that catchment to coast approach, to think about which partners need to be involved. How do we work in a truly partner and collaborative way to deliver solutions across the whole system and fundamentally, from my perspective, support sustainable ocean, coasts and seas. And I think that's really important for us to recognize that, you know, everybody on this call, everybody represented in these images will have a different relationship, a different impact, a different set of values associated with the marine and coastal environment. And that's not just true of people who might be traditionally seen as coastal communities or people who have a role in coastal decision making. I think it's important for us to recognize that inland communities can have that connection, that sense of attachment, that desire to be part of that partnership working to support our marine and coastal environments. And so I think we need to really ensure that we're challenging the assumptions that we make about who gets to be involved and who gets to be part of those processes, whose voices get to be heard. Of course, one of the things that we're seeing a lot as we think about working towards climate adaptation and mitigation and net zero and net gain, so biodiversity recovery, nature positive solutions, are things like nature-based solutions and how we can work with nature to try to address some of these challenges that we're facing. And then from a social science perspective, there's a real need to ensure that we're working with communities when we think about nature-based solutions, and we're bringing them into conversations at a very early stage, as both Chris and Diana have talked about already. One of the examples that I know has happened in quite a positive way around the Severn Estuary, which is where I'm based, is around Sturt Marshes, where there's been a kind of a managed retreat process of the creation and restoration of Sturt Marshes. And I think the community in that area had been engaged at a very early stage, and as a result, there's quite a positive relationship with that space, and that's a really great example of seeing where that can work well.
1 minute to go, Emma.
Oh my goodness, okay, I'm going to speed up. Increasingly, we're seeing the need to think about rewilding and restoring oceans. And again, that really comes back to that idea of partnership working and collaboration. I'm going to skip natural capital and come to ocean equity really quickly. I think one of the really dominant framings that we're seeing more and more often, and it really kind of speaks to the importance of thinking about how we structure partnership, is ensuring equity and inclusivity across that space. This work from Nathan Bennett and colleagues really sets out that equity is not just about who is involved in processes, but who gets to benefit from those processes. What is the distributional equity? Who is recognized for their involvement? How are local communities recognized through process? And how are different contexts taken into consideration? So all of that needs to be considered when we're talking about partnership. And I'm going to speed through my last couple of slides. Okay, so some really quick takeaways are that, of course, this is not exhaustive, and it's just my perspective on where I'm seeing emergent trends come through. I think one of the kind of fundamental points is that we're seeing increasing calls to challenge business as usual approaches and not just continue to conform to the status quo. We, as a community, need to ensure that we continue to embrace and champion transdisciplinarity and thinking with that very much whole system and whole society approach, including those more than human elements, and diversifying the way that we do ocean research. And that's in terms of institutional work, how things are funded, who we engage in those processes, the kind of research we're doing, and the partnership working we're doing, thinking about what that really, really means, so that we centre meaningful and equitable co-design and co-development. And I know that'll come up more and more later. We need to ensure that we recognise that this kind of research across ocean spaces, but also other environmental spaces, is really broad. So we should build on those communities of expertise, research and practice. Thank you. 50 minutes go so fast.
Thank you so much, Emma. Thank you. Okay, moving on to our next speaker, we have Mark Lloyd. He's led a wide range of conservation organisations in the water sector over the past 35 years and is currently Chief Executive of the Rivers Trust. He's going to be telling us about what he sees in the future of rivers and wetlands. Mark, over to you.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks very much for those presentations. They set up mine really nicely, so I was cheering along. Just to explain this slide, it's not just a pretty picture. This is actually was a very muddy field with cows paddling around in a little stream, and lots of polluting matter going downstream, and also a flood risk. But we found out through local connections and talking to landowners, and building on Chris's point, that the farmer's wife wanted a lake, and so for free we got the land and built a bund, which has created this storage area which controls pollution, reduces flood risk, creates a lovely bit of habitat, and probably locks up quite a lot of carbon as well. So through these local connections and talking to people about what's important to them, you can find great opportunities to do things very cost effectively. So that's just by way of introduction to that slide. And let me just navigate. Yeah, I'm just going to give you a very brief introduction to the Rivers Trust and also catchment partnerships as part of the catchment-based approach. Talk a little bit about the state of our rivers, and then give an example of an integrated solution we've delivered, one of many, and then finish with sort of what needs to change. And we do have a great opportunity for change at the moment. So the Rivers Trust movement is about 30 years old, and developed kind of organically with local people getting together and saying something's wrong with our river, we need to fix it. And then they formed charities, and then they all found each other in different parts of the country and formed what was called the Association of Rivers Trusts initially 20 years ago, and has now become the Rivers Trust. And we've got 67 trusts now covering the whole of the United Kingdom and an increasing portion of Ireland as well. So it's really been a sort of very rapidly growing movement, turns over about £70 million now, employs about 600 or 700 people. And here are our statistics. These are probably sort of England and Ireland statistics. In Wales, there's Afonydd Cymru, which is a sister organisation, and Scotland, Fisheries Management Scotland. But you can see the outputs there. I won't read them out all out, but 500,000 trees we planted last year, 894 hectares of wetlands restored, and open up nearly 550 kilometres of river for fish passage. So a lot of work going on at a really local level in partnership with local communities, and always driven with partnership funding. Confusingly, 10 years ago, the government launched something called the catchment-based approach in response to challenges about the slow progress in restoring our rivers. Unfortunately, they really underfunded it and gave each partnership, there are 103 across England, gave each partnership £15,000 a year to operate, which isn't really enough. Partnerships have done very well at levering in money. So for every pound of government funding, they've brought in £3.50 or £3.50 of non-government money and have achieved some great outputs. There's a great synergy between catchment partnerships and Rivers Trust. I think we host about 70% of them, but many of them are hosted by other groups like wildlife trusts and farming and wildlife advisory groups. And I'll come back to catchment partnerships a bit later on. So talking a little bit about the state of our rivers, this is from the Rivers Trust report, the State of Our Rivers report, which you'll find on our website. And broadly speaking, you'll see at the top the sectors responsible for reasons for not achieving good ecological status, which is the Water Framework Directive definition of a healthy river. And you'll see that agriculture and rural land management is the principal culprit, with the water industry not far behind, and urban and transport kind of coming up the rails, I think, particularly with more developments, responsible for 26%. Now, you'll see that those figures don't add up to 100, they add up to about 44%. So that's because most of our rivers suffer from multiple pressures, and you can see them kind of listed out there in more detail. Now, we know that these data are estimates. We don't have nearly enough data to assess the health of our rivers and to attribute sources effectively. So we do need far better data. Now, all of these things interact. So low flows in rivers mean that pollutants are more concentrated, and temperatures increase. So if there's not enough habitat in a river, then it's much less resilient to pollution inputs. And all of those interact. There's a huge number of interactions between all of those different issues. So overall, we've got often too much water, as we've had in recent weeks, and as we've seen in some of our recent droughts, too little water in the summer, and it's too dirty, too hot, and there's not enough nature. Now, all of this is going to be made worse with climate change, and you can see the graph on the right. That blue patch is sort of what happened in the 20th century. There's rainfall on the y-axis and temperature on the x. And, you know, we were pretty stable really through the 20th century. And then what we've seen is temperatures, as we know, increasing rapidly, but also rainfall amounts increasing, and most of that is falling in very intense bursts in the winter, so causing a lot of flooding and also causing our sewers to overflow more frequently. And you can see from our sewage map on the left, those are sewer overflows in some of our most precious rivers, which are chalk streams, which we have 85% of the world's chalk streams in England. That is a lot of raw sewage going into rivers, which is by no means the biggest source of pollution, despite what you might read in the media. Now, what we feel is the best way of solving this is to take a really kind of integrated and systems approach, as we've just heard, to managing catchments in a more holistic and integrated way. And really, the principle behind it is that we slow the flow of water across the landscape. We allow nature more of a chance to purify pollutants for water to soak into aquifers and to be held in the soil and reduce flood risk. And by taking that kind of integrated approach, you can solve multiple problems at the same time. And I won't go into all the detailed measures, but I'll just give you a flavor of some of the things that we think are really important and could be really game changing to the health of our rivers. And the first is really land management. And it really is the biggest problem for rivers, but it's probably also the quickest, easiest and cheapest for us to solve if we just adopt some new management techniques. And you'll see on the top left of those pictures is a maize field which has been left bare over the winter. Huge amounts of soil and water have run off that. You can see the debris on the gate where there where the level of the water was in a recent rainstorm, and that is an absolute disgrace for the health of the rivers downstream. In the top right is a picture I took of open cast sheep mining in the Welsh borders. And again, that's basically like concrete in terms of its permeability, and a huge amount of soil and water is rushing off it. Slurry spreading, and obviously the issues of chicken manure being disposed of on the land as a waste product. It's not really used as a fertilizer. It's just they have to get rid of it somewhere. Is a huge problem, and we have a phosphate crisis in many of our rivers. And of course, in the urban landscape, we have this vast acreage of paved areas, which means that water, instead of soaking into the ground, rushes off, causes surface water flooding, sewer overflows, and river flooding. So soil is absolutely key to all of this. We need to manage water where the raindrop hits the land. As soon as you're managing it further downstream, you're playing catch up, and it's more expensive and more difficult to do it. So it's very important that the water has the opportunity to soak into the ground, be held in the soil, and recharge our aquifers and not flood people downstream. And a good way of doing this in urban areas is to put in sustainable drainage schemes. These are fantastic. They green our urban areas. They cool our overheated streets. They reduce the fear of crime. They're fantastic for people's mental health and general amenity. And of course, they tackle the deep-seated problems we have with overloading our sewage system and all that urban flooding. So lots of great stuff that you can do in urban areas, and we need to be doing this as standard in all new developments, and retrofitting them wherever possible into our landscape. In the rural landscape, that sort of vast acreage that we have, not in urban areas, there are a whole series of things. I've talked about soils. We've heard about peat already and the need to re-wet it for carbon reasons, but fantastic for water quality and quantity issues. And storing water in the landscape. We've lost about 85% of our wetlands in this country, and we really need to bring them back. Of course, you can do things in river channels with leaky dams and large woody debris, just to kind of reduce that those flood peaks, and obviously planting trees and re-wiggling our over-straightened rivers are other really important things that we can do. So how do we fund all this? And I think that water provides a fantastic opportunity to weave together a whole series of funding streams in partnership delivery. And they're all listed there on the left-hand side. There's sort of major opportunities, but there are some big money being spent in water. The water companies are about to spend £106 billion over the next 5 years. A lot of that is going to be spent on their assets, not nearly enough on catchment management. But flood risk management is again a sort of multi-billion-pound business. And of course, there are all these new opportunities like biodiversity net gain and the Nature Recovery Fund, which is being talked about, and offsets and nutrient neutrality and things. And those can be woven together with other things like farm subsidies, and CSR and ESG funding, which is increasingly coming from corporates, to put a bigger package of funding together, which can deliver integrated solutions with these multiple benefits, rather than trying to solve one problem at a time. So I'm just going to give you a very quick case study of the River Wyre. This is Churchtown, pictured in the top left, which is a community which has suffered 3 1 in 50-year floods in the last 20 years, and they're not eligible for flood defences, for concrete flood defences, because the cost-benefit analysis didn't stack up. So they were stuck with this awful flood risk that could happen at any moment. So we
1 minute to go, Mark.
Sure, that's fine. We got £1 million worth of funding to rough up the catchment, as you can see here, with all the measures that I've been talking about. And then we put together a model, and that £1 million paid for ecosystem assets in the form I've described. That delivered ecosystem services And then we found people who would buy those services. So Flood Re, Sainsbury's, Lloyd's Bank for the trees, United Utilities, the Regional Flood and Coastal Committee. And then that's going to pay back the investors over a 10-year period with interest. So it's meant that we could front load all that action and deliver something very innovative. So I'll skip over that slide, but it's very important that we take this catchment-based approach and think of our landscape as a river landscape, and those are ready-made nature recovery networks. So we saw recently a march on the streets of London for the March for Water, and lots of people were clamoring for change, but we didn't hear anyone chanting the slogan, what do we want? Integrated, optimized catchment management based on good evidence. And we have this great opportunity now to influence the water sector through the Cunliffe Commission. I've put there the things that we need to see change as part of that. We will be asking inputting to that commission to really revolutionize our water system, which I think could really drive a dramatic change in the way that we manage our whole landscapes, because water brings an enormous amount of funding to deliver a lot of the nature recovery that we really need to see, and there isn't any other obvious way of funding that. And a lot of that needs to be through the catchment partnerships, working at that very local level, but with a new regional and devolved decision-making process to bring together multiple sources of funding to deliver that much more integrated approach. And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. Okay, Mark, Emma, and Chris, please don't go anywhere. Let's have a look. We've got a couple of questions for you. So the first one, we had some thoughts. Someone said that they were surprised that agriculture and rural land management were presented by Mark as being more responsible than water companies for the poor state of our rivers. Yet in the media, water companies with their high leverage, globally owned corporate structures are the real villains and farmers are the relative goodies. The question, what does this say about the role of the prevailing economic system in changing climate and nature futures? So I'm going to offer that to Mark first, and then if Emma or Chris want to come in.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there have been some awful practices from some water companies, and many of them, a lot of money has been extracted to make a few people very rich. But they have been painted as the villains. And I think in a way we need to sort of shift our thinking to thinking, as I've said, in a much more integrated way, and think, well, how could those water companies contribute to changing land management? And often, actually, the best solution would be for them to spend their money in the catchment, and you would get a much greater reduction per pound of pollution by changing land management practices. And of course, farmers do have, a very important role to play in food security, and they do have, very powerful PR organisations speaking on their behalf. But they are trapped in a really tricky situation where their input costs have gone soaring up. They're price takers, so they don't get as much for their produce as they should, and they're being asked to deliver a whole lot of more services for society. So we really need to find ways of farmers being funded to take action in the long term, as we heard, to commit to restoring our landscape. So there's a great partnership there waiting to happen. It does happen in some places, but it needs to be systemized rather than made occasional.
Thank you, Mark. Emma or Chris? Chris, I can see you've got your...
Well, no, I think, the fair part of the media. I think for water companies, I think the issue is that they're all villains to varying degrees. Whereas if you look at farmers, there's a proportion, there's a small number of fairly small run of rotten apples in the photos you showed, Mark. I think but there are many who are exemplary in their land management and understanding around water issues. So there's a lot of good opportunity for peer-to-peer learning within that, and sharing that good practice. I know the Rivers Trust are involved, sense in that, but equally, to varying degrees, we're all a bit wrapped up in this because there are some really quite nasty stuff coming off roads. And pretty much all of us will drive cars and those come, etc. So, you know, we're not all blameless in this arena. So, in water yeah, we're all stuck in there to some degree, and we need to be thinking much more carefully about that. But as Mark's saying, it's those integrated solutions that we can work on.
Thanks, Chris.
And
Emma,
better funding.
do you see any sort of parallels with your work when it comes to the role of the economic system in the future?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And actually, funnily enough, the Diverse Marine Values project that I mentioned, we included the Y catchment as a case study site. So despite it being a marine project, I challenged my salty colleagues to include somewhere that was not so typically marine or coastal, and is very influenced by the Severn Estuary and the tidal range of the estuary. And so we included the Y and the Usk as a case study site in that project. And water quality, as I'm sure is not a surprise, was one of the key topics in that area when we were asking people about their concerns and their relationship with their local environment. And the conversations that have happened just now around responsibility and who should be taking accountability, I suppose, for solutions is really kind of echoed in the conversations we had in those groups. There's a really beautiful film that we produced called Watershed, which actually interviews a couple of the farmers around the Y and kind of talks about some of the work that is being done. So I think it's really important to kind of champion those really great examples and recognise, as has already been said, that actually there are many farmers. It's come up in some conversations with Welsh Government recently that actually the calls to support nature recovery while also supporting climate adaptation, whilst also supporting food security and provision, are putting huge demands on the agricultural sector in a way that, and they're not being funded adequately to deliver that. And I'm sure that's true of other industries as well. So I think it is kind of towards that partnership piece, isn't it, that we really need to make sure we're working much more effectively with those stakeholders and those groups.
Thank you, Emma. We've got another question, which was, what are you most hopeful about and what are you most concerned about in your sector? So I'm gonna, we don't have loads of time, so if you can keep this short and sweet, I'm going to come to you, Mark. What are you most hopeful about and what are you most concerned about?
I think I'm most hopeful about the Cunliffe Commission. I think this is a once in a blue moon opportunity to really kind of do something radical and different. And what I'm most worried about, I suppose, is that we're going to bottle it and just sort of tweak things, bring in a few little bits of legislation and not really kind of grasp the nettle and do something radical, which is, you know, often the case. Governments have a habit of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, but we have a great chance, I think, to do something really cool.
Thanks, Mark. Chris, what are you most hopeful? What are you most concerned about?
Yeah, I hope for just the sheer imagination of local people to come up with innovative solutions. Those climathons I mentioned, just extraordinary. The amount of energy you can create. It's a great Japanese proverb, that you have all you need. So we may not feel that nature and climate gets the attention it needs, but actually I think around us we have all the skills and sets that we need. So we just need to get on with it, working out. What am I concerned about? That's a really difficult one. I think we're a fascinating moment at now. We seem to be. It's that clamour for attention distracts us. So there's so much noise going on at high level that they seem to just chase. The things which are not, I don't think, are overly important.
Thanks, Chris. Emma.
I am generally quite an optimistic person, so I try to hold on to the hope bit. the fact that conversations like this are happening when 15 years ago they weren't, for me, brings me quite a lot of hope. And not just in an echo chamber where I'm surrounded by similar people, like they're happening in other places as well. And particularly for the kind of work I do, where 15 years ago people would go, why are you talking about people? Why do we need to talk about people when you're talking about marine science? Why do we need to talk about how communities are involved? That's changing, and it has changed a lot. So that for me brings me a lot of hope. However, the pace and scale of that change is not as rapid as we need it to be. And we see a lot of fantastic conversations and initiatives, but I think the action and taking action at a pace and scale that's needed is the concern for me. We need to, moving from talking to action is something we need to do more.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're pretty much out of time, so I'm not going to ask any more questions, but I will invite Mark, Chris and Emma. I have seen a couple more questions go into the chat. Please do feel free, if you have a chance, to have a look at those and respond to people in the chat. We've got a break coming up, but just before the break, there's an opportunity for everyone to just reflect for a couple of minutes. My colleague's going to share a link into the chat box, which takes you through to an online ideation tool that we use. It's called Group Map. It's a place to kind of capture thoughts and ideas. If you follow that link, just take a moment. The question in there is, what futures do you see? So what kind of trends and changes do you see on the horizon? Take a moment to share those, reflect on what you've heard so far, and then have a break. And we're going to return back at 11 o'clock for our next session, which we're going to hear from 3 people around sort of stories that will help hopefully inspire, give some insight into practical application. So please follow that link, share some of your thoughts, have a break. Make sure you do take the opportunity, if you've been sat at the screen for a long time, get away from the screen, have a stretch, and then we'll see you back at 11 o'clock. Thank you.
Ecology and a wildlife photographer based in Mid Wales with experience working on various ecological restoration projects and landscape partnerships. In particular, he was involved with the development of the Canol project in Mid Wales, which he's hopefully going to share with us now. So Dan, over to you.
Hi there. Yeah, brilliant. Thanks for the intro, and I'll just see if I can negotiate the tech. Brilliant. Hopefully that looks all right. Yeah, fantastic. Well, good to be here. Thanks for the invite, and yeah, thanks for the series of talks so far. It's been really, really interesting. And I'm just going to try in 15 minutes, if I can, give a bit of an in Mid Wales around, sort of how we look at doing sort of landscape scale sort of partnership working, both focused on sort of ecological restoration, but also very much trying to bring do that centered on people. And I'm going to focus quite a bit on a project that people have heard probably about, which is Summit to Sea. But just briefly, Canol, which is the current project, which I'll hopefully be able to expand on a little bit more later, is based in Mid Wales. And Canol, the name itself, means middle ground. And that very much sort of sets the tone and the scene for sort of what we're aiming to in the middle, often involving compromise, working with a diversity of different sort of stakeholders and land managers in this area to achieve sort of positive outcomes, really. The co-design vision for this project is that a community that's designing and providing positive outcomes for nature and people. And it's both encompassing the land and the sea, quite a it's a very broad project integrating those different aspects, and I'll show you a bit more about the actual landscape in a second, how that comes together. But the majority of this talk is going to be more focused on sort of learning from past experiences, how not to do from a project that Tir Canol came from, which was called Summit to Sea. And this was quite a controversial project, to say the least, for a variety of reasons, which I'll go into in a sec. But suffice to say that local communities in this area of Mid Wales were really not heavily, sort of not even consulted and engaged. But not really any sort of participatory involvement in forming it, and the backlash for a variety of reasons was pretty intense. And you can see with some of the headlines here, very much not a particularly helpful way that it was done and how it was received. So Summit to Sea, as it was, began in 2019. And with sort of the aim of essentially sort of looking at ecological and economic resilience across a very large landscape in mid Wales. And the ideas were sort of developed over about a year. There were local consultation periods, sort of town hall events and things where people were invited to sort of hear about some of the ideas that were being posited and discuss some of these. And broadly, the feedback was quite positive, really. Like, if there's money, certainly in terms of the farming context, if there's money to help us, do things better for the environment, then we're up for that. But what happened next really was the critical thing. So funding from the Endangered Landscapes programme was secured for 3.8 million. And the lead charity that was brought on to sort of run the project was Rewilding Britain, with a variety of different sort of local NGOs and projects in the area as well. And the ecological proposals within this weren't especially radical, but unfortunately, the sort of communications, the language used, and the way that things went about this next stage after the funding was secured led to its sort of unraveling, really. And just briefly, I'll just show you here the sort of landscape area that we're working within. You've got the Dubby Valley in the north area of the project area, Cardigan Bay out to the west with a significant area of sort of special area of conservation, Aberystwyth on the sort of southern border, and a large sort of upland mountainous region at the centre with Pumlummon, the mountain there. And the idea broadly at this stage was sort of to look at joining up habitats between existing sort of nature reserves, which are those pink sort of squares there, and have a sort of corridor of nature-rich land from the top of the mountain down through the estuary and out to the sea. And I think one of the sort of most important things to look at in terms of the context for this is this map here, which shows the sort of the original project area of Summit to Sea and the land ownership boundaries within that area. And you can see here, it's a pretty complex picture. You're talking hundreds of different landowners, largely a farming landscape. Welsh farming families that have been there for generations on the land. You do have a significant amount of public land, like public forestry and things as well. But the majority, if you're wanting to do anything at landscape scale in this region or across any areas of Wales for that matter, you're going to have to look at working, with these, with people managing, living on the land, and find out how we can come to areas of agreement around restoring biodiversity and how we can go about that. And that sort of didn't really happen in this instance. And just to contrast that land ownership sort of Connect project, a massive landscape scale rewilding project in Scotland, which between 4 landowners has about 60,000 hectares to sort of implement a vision around the sort of rewilding of this area. Whereas to try and do something like that in Wales, you can't even compare it really. It's just a completely different scale and different realm of land ownership. So what actually sort of went wrong with Summit to Sea was a sort of lack of participation really at the base level in terms of people sort of actually forming the ideas that were going into the project vision. It was more formed by a sort of small group of people, and the sort of ecological sort of ideas and things came from a very small selection. And whilst people were consulted and engaged, it wasn't full participation, and I'll come to that in a sec. Sort of poor communication was another really, really massive thing, really. So as I said before, there were this series of consultation events. The funding was acquired, but instead of then going back to a lot of the people that had been involved in those consultations and be like, look, we've got the funding, what can we do together now? the project was sort of launched publicly online, and words like rewilding and quite unhelpful statements were sort of incorporated into a lot of the press releases and things. So the first thing a lot of local people knew about the funding being acquired was that of online articles and things saying that a massive area of Mid Wales was going to be rewilded. And that, literally just that, from the start point then, was like firefighting for a year or more for the project to actually achieve anything. And as I said, the sort of unhelpful and inappropriate use of language. Rewilding is really not a great term in Wales. Certainly, if you're trying to work with sort of farming communities, it's perceived as being something that would remove people off the land and replace sort of farming communities with sort of pack of wolves and not much else. Imposed on a landscape where people have been for generations, and also the actual sort of concept has come from a book largely. Well, obviously concepts come from a lot of different places, but for a lot of people that you work with in Wales, George Monbiot's original book Feral really heavily laid into the Welsh farming landscape as being that of a green desert and ecologically undiverse, and so rewilding sort of has seen as coming from that. And so as soon as people hear anything about rewilding or George Monbiot, straight away, the barriers come up and they're switched off. So it doesn't do any sort of good. Yeah, it doesn't really help to use language like rewilding, which unfortunately was what was used around this. And so all of these things together, even though there wasn't any proposals around land acquisition from local, people or anything like that, just the perception of all of these combined led to the project eventually sort of collapsing really. And Rewilding Britain, the lead charity at that time, fair play, they did back away and they completely left the partnership at that point. Left that to a local sort of group of NGOs to sort of figure out what to do next and pick up the sort of the shards and see about trying to transform this wreckage. And that's what's happened since, really. So the journey that was embarked upon in the end of 2019, was that of a long road to rebuilding trust with local communities across this whole area. To contrast and to sort of bring in some of the key learnings really from this period. One is around, it's been mentioned already in this event, participatory approach, and with Summit to Sea, this was mostly consultation and engagement, whereas what was embarked upon at the end of 2019 for a 2-year process was a really well-run sort of co-design and co-production event. Initially, my colleague and good friend Shan Stacey would just, she'd just go to town hall or, sort of areas where people could just come and vent essentially of what their frustrations and angst had been with the previous project. And initially that was it was just listening. And then later on running a whole series of workshops over those 2 years where people from all sorts of different communities in the area, not just sort of farming community, but people along the coast and in villages and towns could come to these workshops and share their sort of ideas about what are the challenges that are going on at the moment facing people and nature in this area, what are the opportunities, what are the ideas, and as Chris was saying, some of the ideas and innovative thoughts that come up from these sort of sharing of shaping of the project are fantastic and maybe a lot more interesting and innovative than originally was going to go into this sort of project. And so through a very long series of really well facilitated events, gradually from starting out with a very broad question to shape these co-design workshops, which is going to focus on, and also the name, which was changed and came out of the co-design process. It's important to say here at this point that practically for these sort of events, for a lot of certainly farming communities, they can't really afford the time to just come to a workshop or a facilitated meeting somewhere in a town. You've got to meet them where they are or have funding to be able to pay for their time to come to these sort of workshops, or better still, meet them where they are, and hold events in barns or something, which is what my friend Sean did. And that, it sets the tone then. You're going to them instead of expecting them to come to you to sort of be involved with these sort of things. And yeah, what emerged from the co-design workshop was that of a real desire for collaboration and increased local control and ownership of the priorities, which and that that sort of ownership starts in this case with the sort of co-design process and putting the ability of control towards the people in the local area. And also what came out was a collective desire to improve the area for nature and for ourselves and for future generations as well. So the second point of learning around all of this, and I've already mentioned this, is around language, both in terms of actual languages. So in this case, we're in the heart of Wales. The original project was not particularly bilingual or particularly respectful towards actually using and really embedding the Welsh language in the project. And that has changed now. Most of the staff on Tir Canol can speak Welsh or first language Welsh, and a lot of the community, but also beyond the actual language, which is in Wales, heavily embedded in landscape. There's a huge amount of wisdom and knowledge and cultural history embedded in the language and the landscape. Beyond that, just the actual sort of words that are used. So yeah, in our case, rewilding, not a particularly useful one to use within projects like this. But also things like, sheep-wrecked desert or restoring degraded land. There's nothing wrong with saying, we're going to restore degraded land, but when it's used in particular instances, it sort of gives the impression that there's nothing there, that it's a complete biodiversity desert, which isn't the case in the Dyfi Valley in the Mid Wales region. It is incredibly diverse. But we've lost a huge amount of biodiversity and we need to restore that and bring it back. But how you go about saying that and communicating that to people is obviously, there's a big difference in how you can use that. And then, yeah, I guess a third thing is around embracing uncertain outcomes. And I guess that comes down to the fundamental way in which the project's actually sort of developed and run. So originally, there was a very clear vision. It was developed by a very small minority of people, and the outcomes sort of tagged onto that could be quite clear as well. We want to see X number of areas sort of restored in this way, or this number of species coming back. What's actually going to come out of it, and what your sort of outcomes and objectives might then end up being, which could be quite different to what maybe you anticipated going into it. And so I think there is a huge aspect to that, and I think it's challenging for a lot of conservation NGOs that maybe aren't used to these sort of approaches to running projects like this. RSPB, Woodland Trust have done a really good job. One of the some of the key partners that actually went about sort of doing this process and going through with it, I think they've done really well. But it also challenges those ways of working and the usual ways attached to funding that's expected of clear outcomes, clear objectives. And in the very nature of the area, we're working with hundreds of different landowners eventually, hopefully, and each one of them might have different priorities, different interests, different business models, so you don't know exactly how things are going to look, apart from broad objectives, perhaps in terms of restoring the landscape and the seas.
1 minute to go there.
Brilliant, thank you. I think it's important to reflect on, will it work? At this point, I'm not going to have enough time to actually go into the detail of what we're doing now and how it's changed since then and what's happening. But there's a brilliant reflection on the co-design phase that's available online. And we don't know, if it will actually, in a couple of years' time, whether it will have scaled up to the extent where it's having a massive difference in Mid Wales. But I think it really does present a fantastic example of, a very contrasting set of approaches to trying to do something like this in quite a complex area. and what is possible in terms of turning a project around from listening to local communities and then really embedding that in the development of something like this. So I really hope it does, and we're able to really scale up and start working solidly together to address some of the challenges that we're facing. But it's certainly too early to tell at this point whether the actual what we can show for it will be really great at this point. It takes a long time, which is at odds with the urgency of our current situation, really. So a few key messages, I guess, but there's loads that can be drawn out of this fascinating sort of process that we've gone through. But suffice to say that at the moment, whilst there is still a lot of people in a very good position of having turned it around, and at least, being able to work with a lot of those individuals and people that were really heavily opposed to the summit to sea as it was, have been involved with the co-design process and forming this new project, who have ownership of it, some really key players in the farming community. So it is a really interesting case study and example. And the website for the project's there. And if you put any questions, I can't actually see the chat here, so I'll have a look at it now. But thanks for listening. And if you'd like to contact the project or myself, I can put some contact details in the chat or whatever. Yeah, brilliant.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ben. I think we had a couple of issues with your rural Welsh internet, potentially a little bit, but I don't think it just only a little bit. I don't think it distracted from your message at all. I think learning from real life experience, especially from things that haven't gone quite as well to plan, really important. So thank you for sharing. There are a couple of questions in the chat. We don't have too much time, but the first one: did any habitat improvement action take place over the 2 years shaping vision time or not? How do you decide the balance between taking time to develop collaboratively and the urgent need for nature recovery?
Yeah, it's a really good point now. No actions, I guess, that could be directly attributed to what is now tiered Canol. But the power of one aspect of the current partnership model is that because we have about 10 different, for example, NGOs involved in the partnership, we're able to share resources at any one point for any one given patch of land. So say I'm working with a farmer who's really interested in peat restoration, because there's a whole bunch of different NGOs involved. One of them might have really good amount of funding for peat at the moment, or expertise in that. So I can get them in, work with the farmer and deliver that, even if we don't have a funding ourselves or the capacity at that moment. And similarly with something like, woodland creation, Woodland Trust have been brilliant. So there was a lot happening with landowners all across the area, just not under the sort of project heading of the tiered Canol during that sort of development phase, where individuals who had relationships with farmers were able to work with Woodland Trust to deliver on things like woodland creation and woodland restoration, which now sits within that partnership of different individuals and local groups that is tiered Canol. So it's quite dynamic, and we're really working towards sort of streamlining that sort of that partnership working in action, really, around the sort of, certainly with the NGOs, and hopefully down the line more and more so with sort of like farming groups and things like that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ben. I think there are more questions in the chat, but I think we're going to have to move on. If you are able to hop in and respond to those questions, that would be really helpful. And I think we might be able to save them and share them with the slides. I'm going to say that we can. We're going to move on to Tobias. This is going to be a little bit different. We're going to run this session as a conversation, but just to introduce you to Tobias. Tobias Laurent Belson is a community artist, designer, activist, and leader in West London. He has worked for over 20 years on successful campaigns and collaborations with grassroots communities, schools, nurseries, councils, and universities. So to lead us off, are you there? Just to double check. Tobias?
Hello.
Hi.
Hey, yeah, I'm here.
So first question, could you tell us a little bit about what motivates you to be a voice for your community?
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you. Thanks for having me here. It's been good. It's been great listening to Ben before me. A lot of what he went through and has been through really chimed with me in my experience. So it's great to follow on such an appropriate talk from him. So thank you. Personally, I think I have a sense of responsibility and frustration. I think, growing up, I've grown up in West London all my life, and to some degree in the seat of power. I've grown up in Kensington and Chelsea, Hammersmith and Fulham, central West London. I've seen a lot of the wealth and the kind of political power that circulates around here, and we're told that all of these things are supposed to be happening, and we're the leaders of the world and all of this sort of stuff, and yet we seem to be crashing everything. And so there was a sense, I think, for me growing up, just this sense of frustration, like, what is happening, and getting, I suppose, into my adult years, moving into my 30s, my 40s, this sense of responsibility that actually, I'm now going to be into this position where I'm going to be the one being asked, what am I doing and what have I done? So that really motivates me to do certain things. And then collectively, I think there's a deep sense of vulnerability. And again, personally as well, there's a deep sense of vulnerability across our communities. I've grown up in predominantly around low income, extremely diverse communities. And we're extremely vulnerable to all sorts of things that swirl around us that seem often completely outside of our control. And then around that, there's an apparent lack of voice for some, and then clearly not for others. And that, goes across certain age groups, obviously certain, demographic factors, whether it's gender, whether it's race, whether it's ability, disability, neurodiversity, etc. There just seems to be, a situation where some have a voice, and that voice is listened to and respected, and others not so much. And then the last two things that really motivate me, I think, are history and a reading of history, and really understanding that people throughout time have changed things through action. People have changed things through raising their voices, through challenging, through not simply accepting, but actually taking their truth to power. And I'm always reminded of the Frederick Douglass quote, that power concedes nothing without demand. It never has, and it never will. And I think my experience of the last 20 years absolutely prove that to be 100% true. You have to demand something of anything or anywhere with power, and that influence. And then finally, I think it's just the outstanding assets across our communities. When you grow up in a closely knit community, you see day to day just the incredible things that communities can do and have to offer, both individually and collectively. And that is incredibly, incredibly inspiring.
It really is, isn't it? In terms of getting those inspiring communities into a project, what would, in your experience, works for community participants to feel that it's worthwhile to be involved in this project?
Yeah, so my thoughts on this are, I think it's around early engagement. I think we heard from the previous speaker, Ben, about obviously a project from Summit to Sea that went, jumped in, went for it. Obviously people had thought, I'm sure there were people who had thought deeply about it and done their work in order to launch it. You don't launch a £3.8 million project on nothing. But it seems that there were some wrong moves there that probably wouldn't have happened, such as the use of language, had you had certain people in the room. and that's something I've experienced a lot, is coming back to the, you know, which voices are there. You have to recognize which voices are in the room and which voices are not in the room. And you have to begin to be very honest about that. You have to begin to acknowledge that simply having qualifications, simply having professional expertise is not the answer to everything. And so early engagement with anything, with communities, to give a clear sense that, you know, that things really are at the beginning, that there are still big, major decisions to make. And therefore there's still work to be done. And therefore the experiences of the community are of value, as opposed to being in a position where you're just ticking some boxes, you're just choosing the colors of the carpet or the curtains. You know, what value is there in that for communities? The earlier you begin, the wider the breadth of experiences within the community you can actually draw in as well. You're actually giving more opportunities to more people in the community. Whereas the further along you go, you are just narrowing the breadth of community involvement. Basically, you're ticking people off and say, no, you're not. There's not going to be a chance for you or you or you, and therefore you're going to be left with pretty much a similar demographic in the room. I think you have to involve local people in really meaningful ways and think, you know, what is that meaningful work? Begin to think about how a project is set up in terms of, you know, governance and board level decision making, strategic decision making, all the way down into operational day-to-day work. Where can community engage with that? Obviously, they can communicate at board level and strategic level, but they could also be engaging at operational level. Think about all of those tasks that happen where community can actually engage, can either bring an important voice, a guide or a steering voice, or actually potentially do the work, which comes back to, you know, the issue of payments and those sorts of things. I think you've got to reflect communities. You've got to engage in the issues of diversity, the issues of how a community is actually made up, both in terms of age, demographics, economic backgrounds, racial backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, you know, global backgrounds, where people have traveled from. Do you live in a village, you know, way outside of London, but has a significant number of Londoners in it because of the movement across the country? You've got to engage with the actual makeup of communities.
Fantastic. So if you have those situations in situ, if you've got the early engagement, if you're doing the enabling the meaningful work and reflecting the communities, what frustrates or hinders the community's ability to engage with your project?
I think, like, back to what I said, is the sense that things are all wrapped up, that it's a fait accompli, that everything's just already really down, and you're just sort of tinkering around the edges. You know, people aren't stupid. You know, it's worth, again, having that kind of sort of mirroring exercise of, you know, if you're thinking something, it's likely other people are thinking it. You know, if you look at this and you think this is all pretty much done and dusted, then why wouldn't other people think that? I think when you get no worthwhile involvement in projects, you then begin to get this fatigue and apathy set in. And that's really deadly. That's deadly for any type of engagement, because that's when you lose the enormous assets that you can actually gain within a community. You know, at the heart of all of this, you know, all of this work, everything, you know, that Dialogue Matters is putting together here with this day, you know, we're talking about engaging in and tapping into the enormous strengths of communities, and partnering the powers of institutions and the enormous positives of institutions with communities, and thinking of communities as institutions, and not thinking of them as separate, but actually understanding that organizational institutions and community institutions working together are always going to come up with better outcomes, are always going to come up with something that is going to be better than simply an individual effort. So you don't want to get to a point where people just aren't interested. I'd say that a lack of investment in that sense is problematic. We need to start really be taking this seriously. This is not just a little thing that you can bolt on, a bit like sort of EDI. EDI isn't a bolt-on. It's us. It's humanity. Equity, diversity, inclusion. That's not a bolt-on. That's us. That's all of us. So it's about really living that. And again, people can tell when you're not. People can tell when it's just a bolt-on and it's just this afterthought, a tick box. We've got to begin to live it. And that's when, when people are not living it, that's when, people get frustrated, especially, for instance, when you're a person of color, or you're a woman, or you have disabilities, or you're coming from some other type of challenging or vulnerable background, then you're living this every day. We're dealing with these kind of little things, small little messaging that's been built up over hundreds, let's be clear, hundreds of years of culture, of and politics and business. We're dealing with the realities of that. Somebody in a wheelchair is dealing with hundreds of years of not having ramps and not having suitable ways into buildings and ways around buildings. And so you've got to start really appreciating that and working that into your work, because I think the flip side of that is creating this us and them mentality, and that's in a sense that's the work that many of us now are doing to unpick that, to unpack that and unpick it, because that sense of us and them again is deadly. It creates that kind of binary dynamic, that oppositional dynamic that then causes an absolute headache for everybody. It's damaging on both sides, on all sides. And then I think lastly, just a comment on therefore there being a sense from communities that you're a cog in the machine. And that comes back to that thing of not just doing things as a bolt-on, but actually really beginning to engage with these issues fully and properly, so that people feel, understood and truly listened to.
Thank you. That's really great. There's questions I'd like to open it up to other people. There's one in the chat. How can formal hierarchical institutions communicate with, let alone partner with, fluid, dispersed community networks?
Yeah, great question. I think to some degree they can't. And, let's be honest about that. I think there was a great question earlier on in one of the talks around, I think it was a certain type of organization engaging maybe with farmers or something. I think there are ways you can begin. You have to engage with training. There's a lot of training out there, now, since COVID and since the way that the pandemic opened many people's eyes to the vulnerabilities of various communities. There's a lot of training now. There's a lot of ways that you can begin to see how communities work and how, for instance, fluid dispersed communities might work. There's a hell of a lot of academic work on this. There's huge amounts of writing on all of this. I've done quite a lot of work with UCL, where there are departments there that engage, constantly in constant, constant stream of publications on all sorts of work like this. So getting into some of that work is helpful, but I think you also, bearing in mind that I've lived both sides. I'm from the grassroots community. I'm also the chair of a land trust that has a very problematic history in West London. So I've seen for the last 5 or 6 years that side of the formal hierarchical institution, and how we do and do not communicate with our extremely fluid, and constantly dispersed and challenged communities and networks. And sometimes it's just not happening. And there are differences between and different needs of the organization and the community that just don't match and don't meet. And in those situations, you need to begin to work together to appreciate that from all sides, I think. But you also have to sometimes accept failure and accept that some things can't be done.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one final thing. Could you give us some final thoughts on priorities for groups to work on, I guess? Are there any things that you'd like to recommend, like final nuggets that you'd like to just really cement that you'd like to recommend as partnerships and participation projects too?
Yes, I mean, I think engaging with the work that's been done, as we heard from the previous talk, this work is being done. The word co-design, or the term co-design, certainly when I started my work, that didn't exist, and it certainly wasn't a commonly used word. Now it's being used by councils, it's being used by government, so the work is being done. But there is a spectrum of that work. There is the work that's being labeled co-design that is really not. And then there's the work that's really really pushing that term and pushing the possibilities of co-design. I'd say engage with the tools that exist. I'd say the work, for instance, of Pablo Sendra at Bartlett. He's produced, and I've worked with him numerous times, like deep within our communities, to try to figure out co-design and really understand the ethics of co-design and what you should and shouldn't be doing on a quite granular level. That's also to go further back, is engage with something I'm sure many people have heard of, but Arnstein's ladder of participation. That's been a critical tool, certainly for my work over the past 10 years, to really identify what's going on in a space and what's really happening. But I would say about that tool, read the whole thing. Don't just use the tool, read the entire piece, which isn't very long. It's something like 20 or 30 page PDF, because she really describes the communities in the United States, which were mostly racialized Black communities, very vulnerable communities. She really goes into some depth about the details of the way that was working, and therefore how that relates to the ladder. So I think it's really engaging with that. I would say find the activists, find the campaigners. They care, they really care. And many of them have incredible knowledge. Many of those groups are very diverse. My experience, I've worked and been part of 5 or 6 campaigns over the past 5 or 10 years, including, some major things, around Grenfell and the like. Yet the diversity within those campaigns is immense. You will have people in their 20s from migrant backgrounds, and you will have people in their 70s and 80s with PhDs and retired on massive pensions, all in the same room, all discussing the same issues. engage with those groups. They are really, they have so much thinking and experience behind them. I'd also say engage with the arts. We are dealing with situations where there are incredibly complex, deep, and often traumatic contexts, and the arts are something that are the best way to actually engage with those. Writing just a report doesn't really touch the sides of some of those issues. The arts are there and are a part of responding to and dealing with some of these issues that are generational, are global, and as I said, deeply traumatic. So I'd say engage with the arts, visual arts, theatre, poetry and spoken word. There's, obviously a huge range. Being mindful of art washing, that this isn't about art washing. This isn't about bringing in an arts group to paint a mural. It's about actually being with arts as a way of actually engaging with very sensitive and difficult situations that sometimes don't have answers. And that's, again, where the arts are incredible to deal with things that don't have answers. And then finally, I'd say just really begin to try to understand, acknowledge and appreciate the level of historical context within all of this. Whether you're going to Wales or whether you're going to Bradford, or whether you're going to Southeast London or to Cornwall, there are historical contexts in all of those spaces that if you are going in to develop, if you are going in to engage, if you are going in to build or make things, you ought to, in a healthy way, you ought to be engaged with that. And you ought to really begin to understand the destructions, the dispossessions, the extractions that have taken place, and the discourses that have taken place. Read local newspapers, go into the archive, read the newspapers and the leaflets of the last 20, 30, 50 years of that space, so that you can understand not to use certain words and not to use certain activities in it with certain people.
Thank you so much, Tobias. That was really great. I think as projects, we can very much get focused on our goals and forget that actually we are focused on the process and like the real authentic, being authentic with the communities, and actually what the outcomes are very important in what you get from the process rather than like the end goal. That's really great. Thank you so much for joining us. Any other questions for Tobias, please put them in the chat and hopefully he'll be able to answer them in there. We're going to hop on to now a interactive little session to see, so that we can reflect on what we've just heard and explore what has inspired us from hearing all of those stories. So hopefully there'll be some links for some breakout groups coming up now. Thank you. So we'll see you in there.
So welcome back, everybody, those that have returned from the break. So in the next session, we are hearing from 4 speakers. So we're going to hear from 2 speakers, then have a short break, another break, and then the final 2 speakers of the day. And this is focused on fresh ideas and insights. And these are coming from various thought leaders to help us catalyse most change within projects and programmes. So I'm going to hand over to Zoe, who's going to handle the intros for the first couple of speakers.
All right, we're going to hop straight in with Henry. Henry Leveson-Gower is an ecological economist and policy analyst with 30 years experience. He has expertise in agricultural, water and environmental policy and regulation, as well as landscape regeneration, governments and funding. He is the founder and CEO of Promoting Economic Pluralism and the editor of The Mint. So hello, Henry, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Zoe. I might say as well that I also work part-time for DEFRA, and just in case there's any sort of question, none of what I'm presenting relates at all to DEFRA policy or draws on any information that I might, but actually don't have, that's somehow privileged or particular to being a member of DEFRA. So I have to just make that statement to be absolutely clear, and so there's no issue there for me. So what I wanted to talk about very briefly, actually, to give an overview and then hopefully take some questions and turn it into a bit of discussion, is the governance frameworks for getting revenue for regenerating landscapes or regenerating just land. And I wanted to compare and contrast two approaches, and to sort of put on the table that maybe, you know, we need more attention possibly to the second approach, which is more integrated, more local than the approach which is quite common, which is more about national markets for nature. So in terms of the mainstream focus, I suppose, on a lot of this sort of work is around the idea that private finance will come in and invest in regenerating land, which then generates tradable commodities, if you like, like carbon credits or biodiversity credits, or which then generate revenue. And so a lot of the work there is done to try and create standards for that commodity, that bit of nature, that can then be traded, and people can then get a revenue to repay the private finance. And this fits quite a lot of sort of environmental economic thinking, which is trying to create markets, and it's the idea of sort of market efficiency and so on. But one of the, I suppose, the key things is that you have to actually get chunks of nature that you can trade. And one of the elements of that tends to be that it separates nature from other sort of activities. So, you know, with net biodiversity gain, you get a separate bit of land, which you then count the sort of ecological benefits of, and it becomes part of the market. With carbon sequestration, you maybe take a bit of land, grow some trees on it, and there's a certain sort of standard way of calculating what that might mean with carbon sequestration. So that is one approach. The other approach, if you take a more place-based integrated approach, is where instead of trying to break the environment into bits that can be traded, you approach it as a more holistic system, you know, as an ecosystem with all the connectivity in them. And you then bring on board both the people who manage the land, both tenants and landowners, and the people who potentially want so-called ecosystem services, i.e. the benefits of the land working better from an environmental viewpoint, who are a range of players. So, I mean, the classic example is if you put a strip of woodland along a waterway, you can reduce flood risk, you can reduce nutrients into the river, you can sequester carbon and create biodiversity gains. And so effectively, you can get efficiency out of the fact that you've got multiple people wanting different benefits from the same bit of action. But you need to have the right sort of governance and legal framework to do that with. The most common one actually at the moment is the Landscape Enterprise Network System, or LENS, which 3Keel based in Oxford promote, where they bring together a set of private beneficiaries of more resilient ecosystem services with a set of farmers, with key, you know, in particular working with Nestle, who are looking to make their supply chains more resilient. But they use contracts to underpin that. And contractual systems can become very complex very quickly and very unwieldy. So you can end up with 30+ different contracts, subcontracts, and so forth. And another way, which I think is less well known and is less implemented, but I think could be quite powerful, is using cooperative law, where cooperative law is actually designed to underpin collaboration by multiple parties, and you only need one legal framework. You have an agreement between multiple parties, and you have rules for making decisions. So that as things change over time, as you learn more about how to deliver ecosystem services, how to improve things, and we're talking very complex systems here, you can adapt the agreements as to exactly what should be done and so on. So what I'd like to put on the table in terms of fresh thinking is that while obviously nature markets have a role and are growing, and from a sort of breaking environment into bits and trading them perspective, there is also an approach that I think we need to think about, where actually you can take a more integrated approach. And this is particularly relevant when you're thinking of nature sharing approaches as opposed to nature sparing approaches, where you're trying to think about regenerative farming, etc., where food and nature is all being built in. So ultimately you're trying for sustainable growing systems. And in those sorts of situations, you don't want to break things into bits. You want food and environment together, and you're really looking at the outcomes in terms of improved environment overall. And again, that sort of local collaboration with beneficiaries and providers seems to be the only framework that will actually work and deliver in those sort of situations. And research, certainly for Sustain 2 or 3 years ago, by Cumulus Consultants, suggested that one of the key ways of regenerative farming becoming viable is that they get revenue from the ecosystem services they provide to make up for the loss of productivity potentially, though that is quite a debated area, but still it would help the viability of regenerative farming if they could get revenue from ecosystem services, which just doesn't work with a sort of nature markets approach. So I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to expand on any of those points and answer any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Henry. I'm going to go straight, hand it over to the floor. Any questions from anybody?
It was obviously brilliantly clear and precise.
Yeah, I'm interested in discourses that I think are cutting edge, but like rights of nature and connected to attempts to kind of institutionalize the representation of nature, like more than human participation. But I'm curious as to whether this has any traction at all in institutions in England or this kind of broader conservation movement.
Well, I think the lens system does have a lot of traction, and actually has been in many ways more successful than the nature markets approach. Now, the lens is a local collaborative approach, though I think its use of contractual law is problematic, and the people who run it know that, but they haven't got around to moving on beyond that yet. And maybe people like Nestle do like contracts, because contracts tend to be associated with one party being able to dictate what other parties do, whereas with a more collaborative approach around cooperative law, etc., the sort of power relationships I think are more sort of equitable, let's say. But this is challenging this, I suppose, the mainstream narrative, and so and there is this thing I think around the environment movement, is that they see that private finance is going to be a sort of big solution, but the truth is I think there's been very little private finance in this area, and Chris Short will back me up on the fact that actually very few people have managed to put in governance systems, effective governance systems. So I'm hoping that increased awareness of this sort of approach will get take up for, apart from anything, that current approaches have just not been working.
Brilliant, thank you. There's a question that's just popped up in the chat, Henry. Where can we find out more about cooperative law agreements and/or good examples, please?
Well, I've written a report with a lawyer, a cooperative lawyer, that covers a lot of this, which could be shared after the event. The main actually working example at the moment is in the area of digital network management, which is a sort of has similar attributes, if you like, to managing landscapes, in that it's about creating networks and connections between different asset owners of the different bits, like the cables and the software centers that make networks work, and a set of people who want to actually use that network. And that is that example, which is referenced in this report, is currently happening in Blackpool, Manchester, Brighton, at least, I think. So the sort of basic principle has been put into practice in other areas, but it is yet to be put in practice in landscape regeneration. But then not a lot has been put into practice in landscape generation. If you go to the website that the GFI, Green Finance Institute, run, you'll find there are very few examples on that website of governance, of landscape governance, actually have it happened anywhere apart from up in Cumbria, which is just about flood risk management, and is a sort of CIC with contracts, and it's yet to be determined whether it'll actually be successful.
Thank you. Anyone else got any questions?
There's some comments about lens, is there?
Brilliant. There are. I was just trying to rummage through them to see which one follows first. Anyone got an eye on that they can know? First, I think, is from Kat. We have worked with Lens a lot, but it is being co-opted to the agenda of moneyed parties. So I'd love to hear more about cooperative approach. We are seeking to establish a catchment fund that could be based on that model.
Well, if anyone would like to contact me to discuss these things further, the actual practice of how you do this is another thing altogether, and you've got to get all the key stakeholders on board for this approach, and then you need to do a co-design process to actually develop the governance and rules, etc. And so it is, you know, it's quite an investment up front, but once you get it in place, you've done all the hard work, and actually doing sort of particular agreements or projects under the governance is really straightforward, because you've created the relationships, you've created the sort of rules of working together and so on. So as opposed to every time you do a contract, you've got to start from scratch. Each contract is self-standing. Most people actually don't read contracts. You know, they can be 30 pages with tons of small print which no one understands, and so actually it may well be that when the proverbial hits the fan, people begin to understand the contracts, or try and find out, or get lawyers' advice and find that they were really, you know, potentially problematic. Whereas with a sort of co-design approach for a cooperative, the key parties are sort of making the rules together, and so hopefully understand them, and it's a much more effective way of working together over the long term, which I think is absolutely necessary in these situations. This is not a transaction, a one-off transaction. This is about establishing long-term landscapes that deliver environmental benefits.
Brilliant, thank you. I think there's another Lens one that expands on something you've mentioned. Lens also requires a very large player with defined environmental risks and landscape to invest in. Nestle and its dairy herds in North Cumbria being a well-connected example, but it does get quite hard to do more. It also doesn't often take a whole scape or whole community approach. It seems to focus specifically. Do you have anything to speak to on that?
Yeah, it all depends how these things are done. I think, you know, the whole spirit of a collaborative approach is that you bring everyone in and you try and get everyone on board and their different concerns, issues on the table, etc. And I suppose if you approach this more as you know, a powerful player like Nestle coming and saying this is how it works, sign here, you maybe get a different result. But that's not, you know, I don't know the details of how these things actually work in practice. But let's say that when there are power differentials, the outcomes can be, shall I say, suboptimal. Can you expand? Says there's a question here. Can you expand on the last point you made, Henry? As I understand it, that currently people can't get benefits from ecosystem services using nature markets. If so, how can emerging markets develop more equitably? I mean, I'm saying that nature markets, by their fundamental concept, create limitations because of this need to commodify nature into bits, if you like. And some parts of nature don't commodify very easily. So, for instance, take flood risk management, which is a property of a complex system and different types of storms, etc., etc. You can't take a bit of land and say, what are the flood risk management benefits from this little bit of land, because it all depends on what else is going on. You can't really do it for nitrates or you know, pollution, because that all mixes up and comes from different sources, etc. So there are limited, I mean, carbon can be, you can sort of measure carbon sequestration from planting trees, but part of the problem here is that I think carbon has been so dominant as a sort of benefit of ecosystems that the danger is everything else is organized around, well, we do this with carbon, therefore let's do the same for everything else, and it just doesn't fit very well. And particularly when you get to regenerative farming, where obviously you've got very complex systems and very diverse outcomes depending on what's being grown, the nature of the soil, all sorts of different attributes. And actually there, what you really need to do is just try and measure the different benefits that you're getting. Monitoring it is quite complex, etc. You probably need citizen science to support it, make it practical, etc., etc. And you're moving far away from this carbon model of some sort of standard, a standard tree and a standard bit of soil with a standard bit of carbon sequestration, which is then sort of tradable and detachable, if you like, from the wider ecosystem. So I'm not suggesting developing markets more equitably, except that, you know, the market model is essentially limited. What you need is different sorts of economic arrangements and economic relationships.
Brilliant. Thank you, Henry. There's one more question that's just come through, but I think I am just going to have to wrap you up so we can move on to Lou, if that's okay. But if you are able to have a look at that in the chat.
Oh, yeah. Do you think that a members co-op could work in a landscape? Would people pay a membership fee, or a consumers co-op? Well, the sort of co-op I'm talking about is a multi-stakeholder co-op, which is different from a members co-op, which is a sort of consumer co-op versus an employee co-op. And so in a multi-stakeholder co-op, you actually have a range of different sorts of members who work together. It's like a structure of making rules of how people work together, how people do things, how resources flow. So it sort of happens at a level above a sort of enterprise, and it can be used to sort of glue together lots of different sorts of enterprises and players with possibly different perspectives and outlooks around the common purpose of landscape regeneration.
Oh, thank you. So moving now on to Lou. Lou, oh, I'm really sorry. I'm going to have a stumble over your last name.
Lecuyer.
Thank you. Lou is an interdisciplinary researcher specialising in environmental management, conflict transformation and power dynamics. She's got 12 years experience in stakeholder conflicts related to wildlife and agricultural issues. And I'm just going to throw straight over to you to launch into it, if that's okay.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. And thanks for inviting me to that event. I'm sorry I couldn't be the whole day with the group. I wish I could have listened to what's been said, and because I quite like to link my presentation to other comment and question you already had. So sorry if there is some part that I've been covered in a way and I could have made link, but I'm in a training on nonviolent communication, systemic nonviolent communication, which is linked to power and interculturality. So I feel like that also goes hands to hands. And I'm here today to talk to you about understanding power in stakeholder and engagement for biodiversity conservation, and which is the last project I worked on. That's a project that's been called Power Biodiv and been funded by the Fondation pour la Recherche sur la Biodiversité. And just to give you the context of how we came to that project and who works on it, the FRB fund data synthesis projects. That's what they fund. They fund big group to do work on data synthesis. Lots of them are about ecological data, but from time to time, we're able to push for a more social project. And here, where we started from, you can all see my screen. That's all just checking. Yeah, okay, good. The starting point of that project is that I've been working on conflict management for a while, participatory approaches and everything. And we know there have been an increased use of participatory approaches that, like everyone say, we should do more participatory, which I agree with. But we were like just starting to have evaluation of really the effects those participatory processes have on social impact and environmental impact, and trying to understand better what element makes them more successful or less successful. And a lot of more studies saying, okay, power is important, but quite often that's all you have in those studies or even report. And you're like, okay, but now what? What can I do with that? Like knowing that power is important, how do I go deeper? How do I think about my practices? How do I implement participatory processes differently? So we built that project with that in mind. Saying that we want to adopt a multidimensional approach to power. So to try to better understand the complexity and diversity of powers that exist. And we propose to do that by integrating scientific information, but also with the voice of institutional actors and facilitators. And so we created a group of 15 people working on that issue. And the way those projects work is that we have workshop where we meet every 6 months or year, depending on the time of the project, and the postdoc, that was me, working on it more full time. And you can see here, Diana was part of the project, Diana Pound from Dialogue Matter. I see Brian is here as well. She came at some point in the workshop to support us on impact. And with that full group of participants, we first worked on trying to understand the multiple dimension of power and trying to creating a framework that help us to analyze power in participatory process for biodiversity, and then build on our experience with participatory process to go deeper. And the way I will go through my presentation is to present you the framework point by point and using case study to illustrate what we mean by, those more theoretical approach on power. And just here we publish that first part I'm going to present you. So if you want to have access to it, that's the name of the paper. And just so you know, to build on our experience, there is 6 case study in total that we use in that paper. One of them is from Dialogue Matters, the first one. I'm not going to use that one today. I'll be too impressed to say something that is not fully right. So I'm going to use one I know, 2 actually that I know a bit more, which are around carnivore management in France and Italy. And that's the example I will use to illustrate what we did on power. And so I'm going to start just by telling you, how did we decide to go on talking about power? Quite often when you talked about power, you think about coercive power and how someone have power over someone else. But we decided to take a more balanced approach of recognizing that power can be everywhere, in individual, group, and nature, that it's present also in our daily life and interaction. It's normal to have power relationship. That's something that always happen. It's fluid, dynamic, and you cannot say it's inherently good or bad. And quick example, as a mother, if you want to protect your child, sometimes you'll use your power as a mother to protect your child. And it's a form of power over, but still, it's kind of we decided to look at power as that continuous balance between power over and transformative power. And sorry, just to tell you maybe a bit more, I forget, on those 2 case studies. Those two case studies are related together because they were funded by the EU. The EU have a platform for the management of large carnivore, and they decided that it's not enough to have a platform at EU level, that they should develop local platform, regional platform to adapt their platform more to the context, and so that they develop those participatory platform where they included different actors to try to take decision around carnivore management. In the first one here in the Alps, they decided to work on the multi-use of spaces and more specifically on the use of protective dog in the context of wolf being back, and the interactions that they have with tourists. And in Grosseto, in Italy, they worked on the protective measure and livestock and to reduce livestock depredation. So here, if you think about those two things, you have power over, and when it comes to wolf, you can think about how wolves were extinct and how they came back, but how that create new power dynamic now between different group of people and between nature and human as well, and how different action and those participatory processes are trying to transform those power relationship. So this is the starting point, and to go even deeper than that and not just say that, we decided to look at, okay, if we think about power, where do those power happen? And we talked about arenas of power. And here, some of you that have already worked on power will see that it comes from power cube approach, and have been developed more by other scientists since, and researcher and practitioner. But what we say by arena of power is, okay, where do you see power happening? And there is power that could happen in a really visible way. How far is power exerted through observable mean, like official authorities, rules, enforcement? That is all related to visible power. And if I take the case of the two platforms on the wolf management, here, for example, one part of visible power would be the protection status under European law of the wolf. It's transparent, everyone knows it, everyone can go what it means. It's changing at the moment. We'll see that will have consequences on how we take decision around wolf, but this is one, for example of visible power. Another example of visible power is power of the different ministry that are in charge of questions related to wolf management, for example. And here, one aspect that affected those two participatory processes are the fragmentation you can have between the ministries. And I guess it's the same in the UK, and you might have discussed that, but in France, we have a strong divide between the agriculture ministries and the environmental ministries with different interest value. And even, even if it's visible, even if it's part of visible power, you can see those tensions that have that do play a role in how your participatory process can take place. The second dimension is around hidden power, and this is about to what extent some people are exerting power, but acting this time behind the scene, trying to influence agendas, decide on the agenda without not everyone being able to see how they're influencing it. And again, if I take the example of those two platforms on carnivore management, what happened in those two platforms, and some of you working on participatory process might have experienced that as well, is that we find out along the way there were some secret alliances between people inside and outside the participatory processes. So you try to make sure that not happen with some ground rule, but you cannot always control that. And that will be for a form of hidden power. Or underlying interpersonal conflict. You enter into a room to facilitate the dialogue, and you have two people that hated each other from a previous participatory process on another issue. And that will play a role, that will act in how they interact and how you can have those participatory process being delivered. So that's the second dimension. The third one is invisible power. And this relate to what extent do existing beliefs, social norm, and culture generate bias, or consciously or not consciously, again, in favor of some people or in disfavor of some people. And I think here, if I go back to the example of the wolf platform, one invisible power playing here is that we decided to work on wolf. And I quite like to call them a sexy species. And you have a lot of participatory process that will be around that, those big spaces, but then a lot of them that will be quite left out. And this is a form of invisible power. The value we give to certain spaces over others is a form of invisible power. And another one that played quite strong role in the platform in France of invisible power was the relationship between rural and near-rural people. So in the one in France, at the end, it was decided to work on a common narrative on the use of those protective dogs for wolf. But here, which narrative do you value the most? The one from rural people that have been here for a long time or near rural people was quite a challenge. And the last arena of power is the systemic power. And this is about how far do deeply embedded social and economic arrangements, such as patriarchy, structural racism, and capitalism, play a role in maintaining existing format of domination. For those of you that are aware of the power cube, that new dimension is more recent. It was not part of the initial power cube. And the people that worked on those framework decided to add one because today we are more able to discuss those dimensions and put it on the table than before. And they thought it was important to make it strong. Is over norm and value. It's really defining what's happening in the society. And here on the wolf, it was a bit harder to find an example, but I think if you think about production and production of sheep and everything, we're still not really talking about degrowth, for example. We're still thinking about how we maintain our capital, how we maintain our development and everything, and that will be related to systemic power, for example. So that's part of the arena of power. And here we say that both power over and transformative power can happen in those places. So that because lots of people associate just power over in those arena, but if you want to challenge power over, you will always use, or you can also use hidden power. You can also have to change invisible power to change it. So that's the reason it's separated. And then the other part of the framework, and I'll show you the full one at the end, but was to work on the expression of power. How in the daily life, in a more like daily basis, how power is expressed. And here we have 4 dimensions. The first one is power 2, and it's about how if our individual have the capacity to pursue and attain their ends, their own ends, and it goes around capacities such as material, resources, money, skills, social network. All that will feed into the power to someone to act. In the example I gave you, we had a lot of difference in power too in the participant. Some of the participants have legitimacy or credibility because it will be the director of the regional park or the representative of something, and that will create a difference in power too in people around the room. You have then the power with, and this is about how people are able to join their forces, find common ground, and act collectively to attain shared ends. And here in the participatory processes I gave you as example, in the case of France, it was in the middle of the COVID that we had to plan those participatory processes. And so it was decided at some point to regroup and just do smaller group between larger participatory processes. And that was actually a really good thing because during those smaller group, more into like people like farmer group or like politician group, they were like the really ability to develop more power with, and they felt they were being listened to. They will learn about their role and representation, and that really supports the long-term process after that. In general, in lots of participatory process, you'll see power with when people act to like validate, to act as a collective, to join forces to find solutions. So that's really something we want to emphasize during those process. And in the process, I told you in the outcome of the participatory process, you can see also some power with that happened. For example, in Italy, at the outcome of the process, there were an alliances between a conservation NGO and an association on livestock guarding dog to prepare a program together and to get funded together to act together on question of protective measure.
Sorry to interrupt, Lloyd. 1 minute left.
Yeah. And the power within is about to what extent does individual self-worth and self-knowledge enable people to pursue their objective. And here I'll give the example of the facilitator. The facilitator, when you come into a participatory process, he normally come in that posture of having power within, which really helps the group to move forward and with empathic behavior and things like that. And the final expression of power is power 4. To what extent do vision and value inspire action that move people towards the change they want? And here it's about common narrative. And in the example of the French one, that was actually the outcome of the project, to have a common narrative on the protective dog. So all those things can happen in space, at different level. Space could be closed, decision happen behind doors. So in the case of the participatory process I showed you, to decide where the participatory process is going to happen, who's going to be invited, and everything did happen behind closed door between the EU and people managing the project. Then we had the invited space with people coming in and being invited to. And claim space is more when you have resistance, people trying to take a place that was not where they were not invited to. In those cases, we don't have, it didn't happen. And level of power, but you can see that the platform happened at local level, but they also relying on more global level on decision on wolf. And so here is the full framework we use to analyze power dimension. And just to let you know as well, we question the place of non-human in that. How do you represent non-human? And really little has been done so far in terms of how can you represent non-human in participatory processes. But we say in the paper that's really something that should be pursue more and think about more. And also around the different place knowledge have, because the vision you have about nature and value will also play a role at what space you will give to non-human. So that's something we also talked about. And yeah, so I will finish here to have questions, but there were other part of the project that you can follow. We had a systematic review that is coming out, a handbook on reflective practice on powers that should be coming out. And Diana can also answer lots of questions on that if you have any other interaction with her, as she's part of the project.
Really great. Thank you very much, Lou.
And yep, up here. And I really like that. I will leave it here for the question, but it's a citation I really like to finish with. And yeah, I won't read it, but let you.
Thank you. We haven't had any questions in the chat, but once you've finished reading the quote, if anyone has any questions, feel free to either pop a hand up or bounce straight out with it. Brilliant. I'll read out the question that just popped up in the chat. This question of representing non-humans, even withers, for example, is what I meant in my question to Henry. Can you expand on that, please?
Sorry, can you say it again? I was trying to see the chat.
I think it's, are you able to expand on how, I'm guessing it's how we represent non-humans, even withers?
So there is experiment around that, on how to represent non-humans. It could be some small exercise first to connect ourselves to nature. It could be questioning who's speaking in the voice of nature and how and why. It could be putting an empty chair in a room, thinking, this is, and just having them materialize. That's something that have been done. In France, there's been an experiment about the judgment of the wolf, or I don't know how to translate it, but in the Middle Age, they had that experiment where they actually tried to judge the wolf as a human being, and they tried to reproduce it, I think, somewhere. So that's, something else. But it's really, I think, about embodied practices. It's to develop our capacity to do embodied practices. And I know Dialogue Matter have been talking with some theater youngster, for example, to represent non-human. So you have to be creative around it, and you have to realize that there always be an anthropomorphism bias in doing that. This is, but I think experimenting it still enlarge the potentiality to find solution.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lou. One more. What is the role of emotion in understanding or shaking power? Martin Luther King mentions love. How do we incorporate that element into practice?
I think that quote, I really liked it, because at some point in the project, we're like, okay, power is going to emerge from our group because that's what we're working on. And I was like, okay, next project, I'll work on love. That's really how I find that quote. And I also make me read a book on power and love from Adam Kahn, which is also expert in facilitation. And I think this emotion is we really take care of that in participatory process today, or we try to create that connection, that sense of group and everything. But sometimes we forget about power. And actually, at the end, it's more power that sometimes is being left out, and we can create that cohesion and everything. And we come to those decisions, and then we realize that there is no power to implement the decision, and it fall down, kind of like that. Things could happen, and we see it happening. And so it's really like trying to be aware they hear, recognize them, talk about them is the first thing, I think, like making the power less taboo. And then use techniques that facilitators use, as like nonviolent communication and everything too, so it can come hands to hands with emotions. That would be my answer.
Okay. Ooh. What? Oh no, I've lost it. The chat's moving so quickly. I actually think we might have run out of time, but there are a few more questions in the chat. If you can have a little look at them, I think they're springing up now.
Okay.
But
because I am in a training, I will have to probably jump out. I'll try to answer quickly to some of them, but if you want to email me and to have other opportunity to continue that conversation, I'm happy to do so.
Brilliant. Thank you. We'll share your email at the
Okay.
end as well. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
We now have time, I think, for a 10-minute break. So if you would like to, I would encourage you to stand up. You can switch your camera off, have a little shake, dance around the room a little bit, maybe get another cup of tea, and then we'll meet you back here at 20 past, maybe. Anyone else want to confirm a time? Cool, 20 past then. We'll see you then.
Should I say welcome back? And that's possibly the shortest 10-minute break ever. Hopefully you managed to step away from the computer for a little bit. So we are moving into the last couple of speakers today. Thank you all very much for your input and questions so far. Much appreciated from us and from the speakers, I know. So without too much delay, we are going to move on to Diana. Diana Pound is a solutionist, internationally known expert in participation, having set up Dialogue Matters in 2000 to enable better quality decisions related to the environment and applying evidence-based participation practice. Some of you may also know she's also led commission research into participation and empowerment and advised organisations, including various parts of the UK government and overseas and international bodies such as Ramsar, OSPAR and the IUCN. Diana, over to you. You have to unmute first, obviously, but
yeah, rookie mistake. Hello, everybody. I hope you're really enjoying today. I am learning so much. So my presentation, when I can move you out the way and see my speakers panel, is about transformative change. Hold on, bear with me. Right, there we go. Transformative change. So I am passionate about the fact that we need to really pick up the pace and radically change the way we go about things. And some of the reason I set up Dialogue Matters was that, or 25 years ago, I was so frustrated with what I was seeing going on around me. And sadly, I still see a lot of that going on around me today. So I'm just going to have a couple of slides about what even I mean by transformative change, a little bit about why share power. So we've just heard about understanding power. I'm going to have a bit on why share it, getting beyond compromise, why bother with participation at all, and what are we finding out works from evidence. So a couple of slides on transformative change. So I looked at lots of definitions, and some of this comes from the IPBES values-based research and report that came out, I think, about 18 months ago now. But it's fundamental change in the way we do things. We can't carry on with business as usual. It's got us where we are. And I include in that the way environmentalists go about involving others in processes of change, whether that's about species or rivers or lakes or climate change or whatever it is. We've kind of been going about it in a way that has not delivered the kind of transformations that we need to see. So it's about bringing positive system level changes. And of course, systems operate at very different levels, shifts in paradigms, goals, ways of working. And for all of that, we need to fundamentally transform the way we collaborate and make decisions. So we've heard lots about the need to do this, but we need to get better at looking at the evidence about what actually works. And it's got to be decision making that includes all these things. So I'm just going to almost like wrap this. So it's got to be like integrative, adaptive, multiple perspectives, inclusive, just, smart. It's got to be imaginative, collaborative, multi-actor, power sharing, enable social learning, having a win-win ethos, and following principles of procedural justice. And I will explain some of those less familiar terms in this presentation. But a couple of slides first about why shared power. Well, in all the research I mentioned in my introductory background thing this morning, we found, and we keep finding, because we do this kind of research, seems to be about every 6-7 years, somebody commissions us to do more research, and we are still finding the same thing, which is that many environmental projects with the very best of intent and all sincereness and all goodwill, but are fundamentally going about engagement, which used to come to mean the full spectrum of levels of influence, but has pretty much now settled to meaning sort of what for me is sort of lowest common possible, which is you're gathering information to inform your own decision making, or you are consulting to be open to influence, but still the decision making process sits away from where the engagement is taking place. And then claims are made for that it delivers great social capital, and social capital is the glue that enables people to work together collaboratively, the knowledge shared, the decisions better informed, the integrated solutions, the commitment to action, and we hear lots about buy-in. You are not generating that at information gathering and consultation levels. You are not building that kind of good stuff if you're keeping power out of the system and the decision-making power sits elsewhere. And we heard from Lou about the work that she and I and others have been doing, thinking about power. And fundamentally, the benefits claimed for involving others depend on representation. So that's that you've got a good mix of perspectives and voices actually having power to decide. And then that power is shared in the decision-making process. The quality by which the decision-making process takes place, I think that's often really overlooked. And when that power is shared through good practice, it results in outputs that have more ambition, greater agreement, and greater stringency, which in turn, of course, leads to better outcome. Fully acknowledging it's hard to prove outcomes because, of course, many of the outcomes will be decades, if not, I was doing some work recently where the timeline is to 2100. So we're making decisions now to 2100. It's going to be hard to prove that the decisions made in 2025 have resulted in good stuff in 2100. So it's hard to absolutely map the outcomes onto the agreed outputs and intentions. But of course, if you don't even have good outputs and intentions, you're not going to get great outcomes. But then that begs the question, who do you share power with? And from the research we did, as I said, many of them are sectoral. So they may be regarding what they're doing as participatory and inclusive, but the other voices might be environmental voices from an NGO, from a local authority, from the public bodies. But then where's the business? Where's the local community voices? Where's recreation? Where's young people? Where's all the other perspectives that might be needed? So we find that when we're designing processes for change, that typically it maps out about 45 to 65 people will bring the relevant knowledges needed to make holistic decisions. And we have a way of doing that that is not based on power and is not based on prior knowledge and interest. It's based on what knowledge, what bit of the jigsaw do you understand? And I'm just going to move on and say that there's this huge fear amongst public bodies that, and sadly, there are not many public body people here because of the embargo on being able to come to things like this. But we are continuously hearing, and I just read something yesterday, we cannot share power because we have a regulatory function. Well, without being too impolite about that, that's bunkum. So, but it's because if you think, if you understand that these processes are processes of negotiation, it really changes your understanding that what you're fundamentally doing is entering a process of negotiation and changing your behavior and negotiating with others who might also have multiple different statutory functions and responsibilities. So to talk about this, I'm actually going to use, this is a graph for those of us who love graphs, but it's actually a story. So I'm just going to use a little story here. So imagine that party A and party B are two people in a cooking competition. So this is, we're thinking celebrity bake-off here. And they are both doing it as celebrities so that they can win money for their favourite charity. And party A wants to win money because they're going to support the introduction of a very rare species somewhere in England. And party B wants the money because they want to get children from very deprived and impoverished areas of London out to enjoy nature. So they're both busy cooking their cakes, trying to win the bake-off competition and get the dosh. and time is pressing, and they're being told time is running away, and they both reach out for the vital ingredient is just going to make that perfect difference to what they're baking and be the perfect win. And all that's left on the side is a lemon, and they both want the lemon. So they both start arguing about why they need the lemon for the rare species that's on its last legs and needs to be introduced, or for the young children who need all the good things about being in nature, and they start arguing about why they ought to have it. And what they fundamentally do is they're trying to negotiate on that triangular diagonal line, which is called the line of compromise. And one then says, okay, we're out of time, and just grabs a knife and slices the lemon in two, and each gets half. And that looks like a good outcome because, hey, that's win-win, isn't it? Well, actually, no, it's win-lose because both are losing half of what they want. But crucially, then what happens is one chucks the skin in the bin and the other chucks the juice in the bin. So actually, if they had changed the way they went about that discussion, they could have found a win-win where everybody got 100% of what they want. And just to say, do we see that in real world situations? Absolutely, we do, more often than you'd ever imagine. And in circumstances I can't conceive of how people are going to get there, but through good process and imagination, they do. More often we get up towards there where more people are getting more of what they want and begin to reconceive and reimagine even what a win begins to look like. And that all comes from changing behavior. So from the left side, it's positional adversarial behavior. On the right, it's principled cooperative behavior. And I will read this out because some people take in information better by hearing than reading. So it goes from the left, which would be withholding information or thinking only yours matter. And of course, the sort of science evidence based in much environmental decision making, that absolutely sits in that box, to sharing multiple different types of information, from making threats to asking questions, to arguing from the position you've adopted about what you insist you must have, to exploring different interests and needs, from attacking the other's knowledge or them to grind them down, to exploring different knowledges and different perspectives, from using your effort and energy to defend your position and work on the other person, to using your effort and energy to seek solutions in parallel with the other people and to work on the challenge together. And the left-hand side forces win-lose or lose-lose, because breakdowns can happen completely, things don't get sorted, nature loses out, people lose out, everybody's disaffected, or moving to a win-win. And fundamentally, that's about a shift in behaviour, and public bodies can absolutely shift to this right-hand side and work collaboratively with others because everybody's got their boundaries, whether it's statutory responsibilities or not. We've all got what can or can't be up for discussion, but in the space between all our different interests, there's the opportunity to innovate how we meet those different needs. So some evidence about why bother with participation. We've heard a lot about it, so I'm not here meaning lightweight engagement. I am meaning people getting around a table and deliberating and deciding together. And here's some evidence. So wise decisions result from diverse knowledges. People are much more open-minded to other people's points of view when they believe they will need to explain their point of view to diverse others. You don't know what others think, you don't know what extent they agree with you, and that helps your mind become more open. People are much more creative in a diverse setting, provided they feel it's safe to communicate. So that's where facilitators come in to make the space safe to do that. People are more willing to accept outcomes that are not their own first preference if they think the process has been legitimate. It also reduces the risk of causing social and psychological shock and trauma. And I think this is really out of sight of environment world, but very beautifully illustrated, well, sadly illustrated in the story we heard about Summit to Sea. So we have this deep connection to place. It's part of our identity, part of how we feel if we're people with the privilege to live in one place for any length of time. And imposed change on that place then feels like trauma to our psyche, our well-being, who we are, how we identify. And the word solastalgia has been found that describes this huge existential stress when change begins to happen to the environment you live in and care about. And you may recall the sycamore gap tree that was felled and the huge outcry across the country, and that was an expression of solastalgia. We avoid that if we make decisions with people. Multiple knowledges provide a holistic view, so we avoid those risks of narrow and linear thinking. We can work on solutions in ways you see more of the system, avoid unintended consequences, and avoid short-term benefit at long-term cost. We can do systems thinking, and there's a whole other presentation about that following mine, so I won't go into this in any great detail, but it is where you'll stop looking at the parts and thinking you can sum the parts and understand what's going on, and you start looking at what are the causal links, what's the system, how's the system behaving, What's in the system? What's out with the system? What are the forces? What's vicious, making things go worse? What's a virtuous links, making things get better? What's stabilizing? What's stagnating? But bit of a surprise, there's new research in 2018 showed the legitimacy paradox. So it was a marine governance research done internationally, and they found that participatory governance, as that increased, it actually reduced the legitimacy and trust in the governance process. And that's not what we expect to hear or find. But how does that also fit with some previous research, which is people are willing to accept outcomes that are not their own first preference if they think the process has been legitimate? And the key word is about legitimacy. So I'm now going to scoot along to what works. And a new paper that came out just a couple of years ago about procedural justice. We need just procedures in the way we go about the decisions of change. And that's about transparency. It's about representation in the decision group, as I've already mentioned. It's about balanced inclusion, so you don't have loads from one interest and virtually nobody from any other interest. It's about unbiased neutral design of the process and professional neutral facilitation. The process enabling the win-wins, like I just illustrated, or the seeking of win-wins and building on common ground, which I just illustrated with that little lemon story. And it's enabling organizations, stakeholders. If you're working at a local level, sometimes we do global stuff, and then of course you're not involving local people. But if you are, communities diversely worked out demographically, as we heard from earlier speakers, and as equals, share their knowledge and understanding, agree what needs to happen, resolve their differences, co-produce ideas, agree the ongoing governance, and implement change together.
1 minute to go, Dinah.
Okay, that's good. So, and to do that, it's been worked out what conditions foster success. So this diagram is not necessarily so quickly to understand, but the middle, the bluer panel, is about the criteria, and then the left would be very difficult to have success, and the right is that would favor success. So the context needs to be conducive. You've got adequate time and money and support, and you're able to do it. People have agreed that this approach should be the way we go. It's a design process, not ad hoc or random surveys and drop-in meetings and occasional this, that, and the other, but it's all designed and coherent. Systematic representation, do the power sharing bit that we've already heard about, match to the spatial scales that people understand and experience as space, early involvement when options are open, and applies regenerative governance underpinning it all. And regenerative governance, so this is a new bit of language as well, a bit like procedural justice, regenerative governance. What does that even mean? Well, it's a very different ethos in governments, where you've got an ethos of service and stewardship, enabling others, wide range of perspective, long-term thinking, and on around the circle, including reflective practice. How are we actually doing in relation to all these good criteria that we're trying to work to? How are we doing on that? How do we need to adjust and do better? I just want to say quickly something about co-production, co-design, co-create, co-delivery, co-benefits, co-this, that, and the other, because we are seeing this language everywhere, and it is not meaning what it says and what it was meant to mean. So way back in 2016, I did a lot of reading and came up with this definition. So it's working together as equals to share resources, power, and responsibility to both plan and implement change, and crucially, share and enjoy the benefits of doing so. And then the pathway to transformative change, inclusive regenerative governance with holistic perspective, procedurally just participation, and deliberative decision making. And if you get it right, and I'm sorry to those from Marine and Rivers, this was funded by the NE on the landscape work, so it's focused on landscape, absolutely applies to everything else. This sun radiating out of all this good stuff, regenerative governance in the middle, good procedural justice for just making decisions, integrated outcomes, delivering for landscapes at least, distinct landscapes, thriving nature, healthy land, thriving land use, thriving people, thriving communities, thriving economies, we all thrive. There we go, I'm done.
Thanks, Diana. Okay, some questions for Diana. I'm just having a quick look in here, and I can see a question. From your definition, are you saying that co-design, co-create, and co-delivery are all part of co-production?
Yeah, I think I would, that it's about co-producing change. Yes.
That's a simple answer.
You told me to keep it short.
That's fine. Do you want to expand on that at all?
Oh, okay. Well, I think all of this language, it started really with co-production and the work of Eleanor Ostrom and all of that kind of thinking going on back decades back. And this language has variously changed. So co-design sort of is a nice bit of language for co-designing the future of a landscape. It kind of sits with that kind of idea. But so some of this language sort of sits better with certain endeavors than others. But is it all co-producing change? Yes, I would say that would be the overarching language. And that's what we used to talk about. Can we take a co-production approach here? And in all honesty, I think it's worth saying that we get quite trapped by the specifications we have to respond to. And I think I can think of, out of 150 projects, we've been liberated and freed to do about maybe 4 or 5 that I would say absolutely tick the co-production box. Yeah.
Thanks, Tyler. We have a question. I think I'm right in thinking that there are plenty of regulatory plough sharing apparatus in the US and Australia. Are you aware of those, or do you know of any of those?
No, I don't actually. Send us links. Let me learn.
There you go.
No,
So
no.
if anyone can share any of that, then or we can have a look at it at some point in the future. Land ownership, particularly where landowners have large areas of land, seems to have such a big impact on power and participation in landscape projects. How can we address this to meaningfully involve others, for example, like local communities in rural places?
Well, no, that's a big question. I'm not sure I can answer that very quickly. So obviously land ownership is a consideration, but part of the journey of change is understanding that land and land ownership is one of multiple interests in land. And then that's about then how do you bring all those different interests together? So we would be bringing landowners together, and that's big landowners like National Trust or the large landowners together with other voices to start thinking, what's the future of this landscape look like that brings multiple benefit? Because they're still absolutely legitimate a stakeholder in change and they have so much control over it, but in understanding that some of what is going on in their land, how it has multiple effects and could draw in new incomes and new opportunities for them, it's about framing the dialogue in those ways, I think. We do conflict management, and then you've got to do more advanced work with some of those individuals. We call it advanced mediation to enable people to be willing to get to even come into the dialogue process. So it can require that, but once you're in the process, the way it's facilitated removes power from individuals' ability to influence the outcome, because we facilitate in a way that we separate the points people are making from who said it. And if you do that, the whole group can start looking at answers on merit, not on who said it and what power they wielded as they attempted to wield the power. That's a clunky
Thanks,
answer.
Donna. Okay, there are 1 or 2 other questions in the chat for you, but I will have to draw under a line under that one and move on to our last but certainly not least speaker, which is Kevin Collins. Welcome. Kevin is a senior lecturer in environment and systems at the Open University, where he teaches both undergraduate and postgraduate environmental modules. His research focuses on participatory and social learning approaches to sustainability and environmental management using systems thinking and practice, with particular interest in water governance. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen okay?
Not yet. Let's see. Have a go at sharing it and see. Yes, we got you. Over to you.
Right, thanks very much. So, systems thinking, social learning, sustainable futures. Diana might recognize this picture. I took this picture because it struck me that here we have a human system, and it's disconnected from its environment system, its natural home. Clearly, it needs to be on the water, and we need to do something about this human system if we are going to kind of navigate or travel to some preferred future. So that's why this picture's here. It's a little kind of insight into the nature of what we're trying to do. So I'm going to talk very briefly about some of these things: context, key ideas in systems thinking, social learning, and some stories from my own sort of research and field experience. I'm going to have to be brief. There's a huge amount I could talk about, but hopefully I'm going to be trying to be reasonably concise. Open University, just very briefly, we've been teaching systems thinking for 50 plus years. And if you want to go and have a look at some of our resources that we have available for free online, just go to the Open University, Open Learn and Systems, and you should get something which looks similar to this little screen here of systems thinking. You can go and look at that at leisure. Systems thinking is absolutely everywhere these days. UK government is investing in it. The OECD has got a unit on it, and all the professional bodies are all talking about the need for systems thinking to address the complexity of environmental change that we see around us. This, of course, is very welcome, but it does mean that we need to be really good at understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about systems. So what I'm going to try and do is just give you a little bit of some key concepts from systems. This is going to be a little bit academic and it's going to be a little bit abstract, and I make no apologies for that, because if we don't talk and understand about some of the key concepts, then we are not going to be we're going to be talking past each other for some considerable time. So why do we need systems thinking in practice? Here's a list of terms that are very common these days, and I invite you to consider what the missing word is for each of these terms is. It's the same word. What's the missing word? You don't have to write it in the chat. Just have a think about it for a second or two. Okay, I'm pretty sure that by the time you got to the fourth or the fifth, you probably guessed it. It is, of course, this word here. We have a climate system, we talk about an ecosystem, we talk about a political system, and so on. But as my colleague Ray Eisen has observed, it's become feral. I think Diana mentioned right at the top that words have begun to lose their meaning, and system is one of those words where it's the entailments of what we mean by it has been lost or translated into many different contexts. So what I want to do is just try and recover some of that insight into what we mean when we use the word system. So firstly, it's absolutely important that we are aware of the choice that we are making explicitly or with awareness or not when we talk about systems. There's kind of two broad camps. One is you talk about systems as existing out there in the real world, as ontologies, that these systems exist, you can engineer them, you can tweak them, they are predictable, and you can deliver certain outcomes. The other sort of element of systems thinking is where we understand systems as constructs. They are epistemologies. They are ways of knowing the complex and rather confusing world that we live and experience. And we use systems as constructs and ideas to make sense of that complex world, to explore it as a learning system. So when people use the word system, some people are using it in this engineering sense, as an ontology, and some people are using it as epistemology, and you need to be clear which kind of camp people are talking in, because if you don't, then people are literally talking past each other and they have different conceptualization of what systems mean. That's one thing we have to gain clarity on. The other thing is this common confusion between systematic and systemic thinking, and I've tried to kind of show this a little bit here. We have systematic, and this comes from the sort of traditional reductionist thinking, where you take a whole, like a bicycle, and you break it down into its component parts, and you examine each part in turn, often through a linear sequence. You might look at each part, describe it, measure it, weigh it, blah, blah, blah. And at the end, you have a lot of information about each individual component. Absolutely fine as a way of thinking. It's been the basis of most modern science and has delivered some fantastic results. A different way of thinking, systemic thinking, is not looking at the individual things so much in detail, but looking at the relationships between those things. Why do these things work as a set of relationships, and what can we say about that? And if we're thinking about a bicycle, if you imagine all the different parts of a bicycle, you put them all together in a certain order, and suddenly you have a bicycle. The bicycle, you've not added anything called a bicycle, but a bicycle has emerged out of that particular order of those different components. That's systemic thinking or systemic approach. And you might argue, having drawn this picture, why has he put that irregular polygon in that same system? Good question. And what we might do is redraw the boundary so that that irregular polygon is outside that particular system group. And on that basis, we can start to talk about some ideas of difference in learning. So Systems thinking then is about combining the systemic and the systematic. And that's, in our work, we see that as where the transformational change is required. We need both. If we just focus on what's in rivers, the water quality, the number of fish, the water volume, without understanding the social relationship of that river to the farming community, to the heritage, to the culture, to the economy, and other decision-making processes, then we will never really get to understand the complexity of that river or how we might improve it. Equally, if we just focus on the systemic, we will never really understand what's happening in the river. So we need both to really enact change and to develop a more holistic response, a duality, where these two forms of knowledge and ways of knowing are brought together rather than in opposition. So that's systems thinking in practice. And system itself, the word actually comes from the Greek verb to place together, synesthai. And it's, in my tradition of systems, it's an organized whole defined by someone as having a purpose, and critically, it's observer dependent. And I can sort of show you that graphically with reference to this diagram. It's a distinction made by someone. They've placed things together, defined a boundary around a group of objects, and they're saying, this is interesting to me. I want to explore this particular group of objects and the relationships between them. It can be anything, absolutely anything in that system. And this is really key, because once we understand that this is what people are doing when they're talking about systems, they're actually constructing a boundary, we can start to understand the difference that people bring to the discussions when they're talking about the river system. They're not all seeing the same river. They're seeing different ways of understanding that river. And it's that difference which makes the difference. And so here's an example of a system of interest. A person looking at a wetland or a pond or a river and drawing that boundary. That's what they're interested in, that particular pond, particular wildfowl, the fish life within it, and maybe the plant aquatic species on the edge. They're not interested in the mountains in the back or the trees. Now you, as somebody else, might come along and say, well, actually, you really need to understand the trees and the other systems here, because otherwise you won't understand how water quality is changed and affected by that land. And so we've expanded the boundary of our inquiry into the nature of this river and this wetland. And that's essentially what we're doing in a lot of research, is trying to expand the boundary of our inquiry to accommodate a variety of perspectives and knowledges. And we do that through something which we sort of call social learning systems. Now, social learning is fundamentally different from participation. And there's a real epistemological boundary in terms of practice, ethics, a whole range of things where we shift from participation to social learning. Nobody wants to go to meetings like this because that isn't social learning, let alone participation. And so what we need to do is understand what it is social learning process might look like. Learning is a fearsomely difficult word to define, and I'm not going to try it, but I am going to draw attention to the different types of learning in broad terms using the wonderful photographs of the French photographer Robert Doisneau. We have individual learning. We've all experienced this. That's no problem. We have individual learning in a social setting, and this blurs the boundary a little bit, but often people get confused. They think this is social learning, but actually it's not. It's still individual learning. In my terms, in my research, social learning is something where you are acting in concert with others. You're adjusting your behavior in relation to the activities of others. And that seems to me to be the real area where we started to develop more sort of systemic insights into how we might change landscapes and environmental futures. Why do we need social learning systems? Well, we don't necessarily, and I think that's also important. Where we have good agreement on the nature of the environmental problem, we can use traditional governance mechanisms. We can use financial incentives, regulation, raise awareness, whatever you choose. It's only when we're getting to unbounded situations that we need to start promoting concerted action, and we need to do that through social learning processes. And so that we're actually constructing the nature of the issue through process of knowing, the process of learning that. So this is very much down that epistemological sort of route of systems thinking. So messy situations. Here's a beautifully serene river. It's not messy at all. But of course, if you know anything about what's been happening in rivers in the last 15, 20 years, you'll know they actually are quite messy situations. And if I'm a systems thinker walking alongside this river, as I often do because it's near to where I live, this is what I'm thinking. And I apologize for the slightly weird nature of my thinking sometimes, but this is what is happening and what I see when I'm looking at this river. There are multiple stakeholders, each with their own individual systems of interest that overlay what this river is, what this river should be doing, and how we might manage this river for the future. So we've got multiple stakeholding, multiple boundary choices about their system of interest, and so on. And that generates multiple contexts, values, experiences, perspectives, and differences. The key thing here is that this might be, for example, an angler, a water company, a regulator, a dog walker, a water company, and so on. All of these different perspectives are valid about what's happening in this river. And it's the key question is how do we design a system or a social learning system which moves beyond this complexity and confusion into something a little bit more coherent and actually able to accommodate these differences. So in our work, what we've been doing is trying to design social learning systems. And here's what I what I mean by a social learning system. I apologize, it looks really quite intimidating, but it's actually extremely simple. And you will have done many of these things in many of your own work, in your own interventions, all in different contexts. Essentially, what we're trying to do is clarify purpose, mapping a situation, engaging conversation, introducing new ideas, developing insights about emergent issues, collating, prioritizing, identifying, and then designing actions. That's nothing new, particularly, other than there's an awful lot of iteration going on between all these different things, which can be different. But critically, on the left, we are valuing the experience of participants. And in that, we're valuing their language, their insights, their roles, their responsibilities, and their experiences, and all of that. So there is a sort of equality sort of built into that requirement of this learning system. And the outputs we recognize can be understanding, changes in understanding, changing social relations, changing social practices, all of which has to be monitored and adjusted. And if it doesn't work, we redesign the whole system to make sure that it does. The really important thing here also, or the value of this model, is that it's actually technique free. You could apply any kinds of techniques to it. Anything you've discussed this morning, you could probably put into this model as long as you're using it with that understanding of people's values and experiences being, valued through this process of clarification, conversations, concepts and ideas, emergent issues and actions. As long as those kind of parameters are met, then you can use almost any technique you like. So where have we done this? And I'm just going to run through extremely briefly, just to flag up a couple of things we've been doing over the years. We've run in the UK, for example, social learning events for drought indicators and impacts, mostly a professional audience, trying to understand the nature of drought in the UK and how we might communicate some of that and develop better processes. I'm not going to talk about it, but essentially we followed that model I just showed you, and it was a very successful process. In Australia, we've run it in all the state capitals, looking at water-sensitive cities, how water-sensitive cities in Australia could be envisaged and what would need to happen for those to be reality. And again, we used a very similar model, and we found that it was extremely effective. Again, the social learning systems could be really short-lived processes, but actually very effective, overcoming enabling interdisciplinarity and integration and moving beyond linear knowledge. And in this case, allowed an awfully large investment in the future of water sensitive cities in Australia. And a couple of other very quick examples. We also use them in an agriculture context. This is a recent project I was involved in, AgriLink. And what we're doing here is we'll be using living labs, which I'm sure you've probably come across if you haven't. They're ubiquitous these days in all sorts of research. And essentially saying, here we have living labs, but we're going to use living labs not as technical processes, but as social learning systems, where we're reconnecting the social into the biophysical and into the economy and so on, and enabling broader conversations about the nature of farming and the farming futures, not just how do we grow better maize, how do we improve, soil health. It's much more reconnecting that social and biophysical. I don't have time to talk about all of that detail, more later if you wish to do so. And finally, we've used that also in agricultural systems in Mediterranean, where we're actually trying to reconnect the socio-ecological systems in these sort of drought areas. Again, it's that using social learning systems to reconnect the biophysical with the cultural, the social, the farming issues, and the communities that rely upon these landscapes. And just as a sort of example here, you can see in the middle here, what we're doing is trying to develop a sort of scientific pathway and a local knowledge pathway, which combine into developing innovative practical solutions. Now, that's not necessarily especially new, but essentially the whole co-design element is understood as social learning. So we're going back to that previous model I showed you, where we're valuing everybody's experiences in that process, in generating outcomes. So what can I say? By nature of conclusion, systems, social learning systems, they're really people-centered. That's absolutely central. But again, we have still have this question of who participates. There's a lot of effort needs to be understood around who's participating. They do value knowledge. They do value languages. They value terms of people's use of ideas and expressions. But they also challenge us to reframe ideas, our narratives and actions. And that's across the piece, as a researcher, as a farmer, as a resident, and so on. And that's really challenging for some people. So, question there. Learning's not linear. And so funders, where you write funding applications, they expect certain outputs. Well, if you're engaging social learning processes, that's more complicated to predict. So you have to manage expectations, both of funders, but also the people in the process you're engaging in. And there's always a possibility of failure. Where we understand change does happen, practice may be constrained. We heard very early on in the discussions today about farmers who want to change or maybe want to do things, but they have financial constraints and they can't do. So there's ethics here of playing around with these systems about how you, if you're engaging people, do you do so knowing what may or may not be possible in the future? And there's a whole range of issues, which I'm sure many of you experience around times and costs and capacity skills to facilitate and participate. But overall, what we see is that social learning systems and systems ideas are really powerful for reframing things and enabling people to step back from their everyday experience and engage with experiences of others. It's not perfect, but it does have some real benefits for reframing and changing our understanding of what's possible in the future. I'm going to stop there. Apologies.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you. We've got a couple of questions in the chat, so we'll take those two and then move on. So, first question: any recommendations for books that explain systems thinking well with environmental examples?
Yeah. Well, our courses do very well. I mean, I've got my book here. Look, there's an introduction to environmental management and systems thinking. Go to the Open University site. I can put a link in the chat where we put in a sort of extract from one of our courses, which does exactly that. We try and sort of put in the systems thinking into environmental management. And we've also done it on various papers, obviously, as well.
Super, thank you. And another, you seem to focus on understanding natural systems as opposed to social systems. Would you agree that trust and truth-telling becomes central when studying social systems? If so, how does this affect the process of social learning?
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't mention trust. I probably should have done. I can't emphasize enough how important trust is in social systems. And we do, in understanding biophysical systems, we use social systems to understand the biophysical. And trust is absolutely essential in that. If you're not listening to somebody who's telling you their most important story that they're ever going to tell you about their landscape, what's important to them, if you're not listening, they're not going to trust you, and there's no point even starting the process. So trust is absolutely fundamental. How do we do that? It's about really listening and valuing what they're telling you and being explicit about how that can be incorporated. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to abide by what they're saying or suggesting, but you do have to show that you and others are taking that into consideration. There's also this issue, I mean, Lou talked about it in terms of power, who has power to make the final decisions. Trusting is about being open with people about what is possible in decisions and what is not possible in terms of we can't change everything, but we can change this.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Henry. Thank you, Lucy, for the last 4 speakers we've had today. We're going to have about 12 minutes or so interactive breakout groups where we'd like you to consider and respond to the question, how can we embed new approaches? So you should get a link in the chat now, or a prompt to go to the breakout rooms. So please do go there, share, take yourself off mute and discuss that question. Welcome back, everybody. I think a few more people might still be making their way virtually, magically into this room. Diana, am I handing over to you, I think, for a wrap up, thank you, all that kind of thing? You might want to unmute.
Oh dear. Thanks very much. Right, so I've just got a slide to share with you, which I hope I've just edited. I just literally just edited it because I realised there was something. There was information about this conference on it, but we're kind of like, that's a bit late now, isn't it? So 2 seconds. So just while I'm doing this, I just would like to say thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to all of you for taking part. We are going to send you a link to get feedback because we do these occasional conferences, but things change. I think our tolerance of being online has reduced after all those years of COVID, so anything that we could learn. Also, if you're able, I don't quite have the feedback form is set up, but or email us that if there's any insights you've got in why so many people wanted to come and couldn't, because what do we need to do about that? Because I think this has been such an important conversation, but sadly not remotely enough people here to hear it all. So what do we need to do differently? If loads wanted to come but couldn't, what was going on? So the slide I just want to show is just some mop up things. So there is that. Can you see that now? Is that showing okay? Is that showing okay? Yeah, okay. So if you're of interest in some practice, I think it's booking up fast, but anyway, we do have our next training courses sometime in May. So let us know if you want to, the feedback form is about this event, but it will also say if you're interested in hearing any more from us, this is some of the stuff going on. Some of you have already asked about the governance and justice research report we did for Natural England. We've got a summary that we are at liberty to send out. The governance and justice research report, for technical reasons that I don't entirely understand, it could not in the end be a Natural England research report. So we have got permission from them. As long as we redact certain bits, we can publish it out as having been funded by Natural England and the purpose of the research and everything, but we just have to redact some sort of bits that we advise Natural England about, and then we send it out as a Dialogue Matters funded by. So that should be available in the next couple of weeks, I think. Of potential interest, we are in the very early stages of developing something called the Plumb Line, which will be an AI-powered tool which will enable a real-time check-in of how your partnership and your participation is going, which would enable people to reflect and make adjustments and do the kind of regenerative governance piece about are we keeping aligned with our values and ways of doing things. I'm also in prep putting together the role of AI in participation, because there's some huge exciting possibilities there, but there are already some very serious rumblings where we have heard a public body suggest that they would use AI personas to basically have the argument and not have to engage with the real people who are really having the argument, so they could keep themselves safe from being shouted at, and then go and tell the real people, well, this is what your AI equivalents would think was a good solution here, so this is what we're going to do here. I find that completely terrifying. But anyway, so there's an article brewing there, and we also have a general resource update, which is very erratic. It used to be like 4 times a year, but now it's when we got time to throw stuff together. It's very sort of just serendipitous about something we've come across, a resource or another event or something, and we send it out to people on that. So when you go on the feedback form, you can click for any or none of this as you would feel moved to do. Imogen, is there anything I've missed, or Zoe or Ross? Oh yes, sorry, and we're also doing some partnership training, which is also, when was the date? I can't remember the date. Zoe, do you want to speak up? Oh, okay. Zoe's been working so hard behind the scenes. She's just forgotten the date. I've forgotten the date. But we are also putting together some partnership training, which will look into all sorts of things about team health, task, governance, some of the stuff Henry's talking about. So sort of all sorts of practical stuff about how do you build and foster a really healthy partnership. So we're working on that as well. So anything else that anybody needs to raise or draw to my attention?
No, just a big thank you to everybody.
Huge thank you.
For coming, for sticking with it, for getting involved, asking lots of questions, sharing ideas and thoughts. It's fantastic.
Yeah, and we will be, where you've done breakouts, we'll be taking that, sorting it all out, and just giving it back to you, because that's a resource of your knowledges. So good practices, you get back your own knowledges and can see what other people have said, so that you can maybe be inspired by some perspectives that happen in groups you weren't in. So just ginormous thank you for those speakers who are still left. Thank you so much for those participants who came along and gave your time to this. I hope you've gone away enriched, inspired, equipped with many, many new thoughts to take you forward in your onward journey as we desperately try and turn the curve for nature and climate. So best of luck to you all. Bye.